Hello, story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. This story takes place about 5 years ago during the late fall. The kind of season where the air is crisp enough to sting your lungs, and the early sunsets seem to stretch the nights longer than they should. I was in my mid-20s, a time when the world felt like it was brimming with opportunities, or maybe just filled with chances to make questionable choices. I lived in a small town in the Midwest, the kind of place where you couldn't sneeze without 3 neighbors knowing about it. My closest friends, Ian and Patrick, shared the same restless energy as I did. We were a tight trio, bonded by a shared love of thrill-seeking and late-night adventures. It all started one chilly Saturday evening. The sky was painted in deep shades of gray, and the forecast warned of a storm rolling in, but the 3 of us didn't care. We had our usual plans: meet at Ian's place, load up on snacks, and debate where the night would take us. Ian's living room was our unofficial base camp, a cozy space cluttered with old movie posters, mismatched furniture, and a faint scent of burnt coffee from the pot he always seemed to forget on the counter. We'd spend most of the day glued to a documentary about abandoned buildings. The narrator's voice droned on about urban decay, cracked windows, and graffiti-covered walls. "You know," Patrick said, tossing a pretzel in his mouth, "we've got our own creepy spot not too far from here." Ian and I turned to him, curious. "You mean the old St. Mary's Hospital?" I asked. "Yeah," Patrick replied, grinning. "I heard it's still standing. Barely. Place shut down decades ago. It's supposed to be haunted or whatever. Now, let me tell you, in a town like ours, rumors about abandoned places are part of the culture. St. Mary's Hospital was no exception. Built in the early 1900s, it was once a bustling medical center, but a fire in the 1980s gutted a significant part of it. Financial troubles followed, and it was left to rot. Stories about strange noises, shadowy figures, and unexplainable events had circulated for years, but I always chalked them up to small-town gossip. We laughed at Patrick's suggestion at first. It wasn't unusual for us to talk big but stick to safe thrills, like driving through back roads or sneaking into an old barn. But that night, something about the hospital felt different. Maybe it was the way Patrick's eyes gleamed with excitement, or how Ian quickly started Googling its location. By 10 p.m., we had our plan set: flashlights, snacks, and the misguided confidence of 3 young men ready for an adventure. The hospital was about a 20-minute drive out of town, situated on the outskirts where the main road met dense woods. As Ian drove, I watched the familiar landmarks disappear, replaced by endless stretches of darkness. When we finally pulled up, the sight of the hospital was far more unnerving than I had imagined. Its massive structure loomed against the night sky, windows shattered, and walls covered in streaks of graffiti. The surrounding area was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. We parked the car a safe distance away and approached cautiously. The air felt colder here, like the building itself was exhaling frost. As we stood before the main entrance, Patrick joked, "Last chance to back out." None of us moved. Inside, the atmosphere changed completely. The once sterile hallways of St. Mary's were now nothing but a maze of debris and decay. Broken tiles crunched under our boots, and the smell of mildew mixed with something metallic hung heavy in the air. Patrick and Ian took the lead, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, while I lingered slightly behind, trying to take everything in. The hospital wasn't just abandoned, it felt wrong. Each step seemed to amplify the silence, and every shadow played tricks on my eyes. We passed empty rooms, some with rusted bed frames, others with piles of medical equipment that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. We reached what must have been the main lobby. The remains of a reception desk sat in the center, with old papers scattered across the floor. Ian picked one up, squinting to read the faded text. Patient records, maybe? He guessed. Patrick shrugged, more interested in a crumbling staircase nearby. Let's check upstairs, Patrick said, already heading toward the steps. Ian and I exchanged a glance, but we followed without question. The second floor was worse. The walls were covered in peeling paint, revealing layers of faded blue and white. The cold seemed to intensify here, and I found myself pulling my jacket tighter. There was an odd stillness, as if the building itself was waiting for something. Ian's flashlight flickered, causing him to smack it against his palm. Great timing, he muttered. Patrick laughed, his voice echoing down the hallway. This place gives creepy a whole new meaning. We pushed forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hospital stretched on endlessly, with every hallway looking identical. Just as I began to question why we thought this was a good idea, Patrick stopped abruptly. Did you hear that? He whispered. Ian and I froze. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft thud, like something falling in the distance. Probably just the wind, Ian offered, though his voice betrayed his nerves. Patrick smirked, but said nothing, leading us toward the source. Little did we know, that faint noise was just the beginning. The sound we heard wasn't much a faint thud, like something had fallen or been dropped, but in a place as lifeless as the abandoned hospital, even the smallest noise carried an eerie weight. We stood frozen in the hallway, flashlights pointed in different directions, scanning for the source. The faint sound of Ian's breathing mixed with the gentle creak of the floor beneath our feet. What was that? Patrick asked, his voice low but more curious than afraid. Probably something falling. Maybe an old beam or part of the ceiling, Ian replied, though he sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than us. I nodded silently, but something didn't sit right with me. The sound hadn't echoed like you'd expect in a hollow, open space. It was muffled, like it had come from a room nearby. Let's just keep going, Patrick said, his tone almost defiant as he took a few steps forward. Reluctantly, Ian and I followed. The hallway stretched ahead of us, its walls narrowing as we moved deeper into the hospital. The once vibrant linoleum floor tiles were now cracked and stained, the remnants of a time when this place bustled with life. A few doors on the left and right stood ajar, revealing rooms stripped bare except for rusted bed frames and broken cabinets. The smell of mildew and rust was stronger now, clinging to the air and scratching the back of my throat. I glanced into one of the rooms as we passed, and my flashlight caught a small detail that made me pause a chair, perfectly upright in the center of the room. Hey, hold on, I called out. Patrick and Ian stopped, turning to see what had caught my attention. What? Ian asked, stepping closer. I pointed my flashlight toward the room. The chair. It's just sitting there. Doesn't it seem weird? Patrick leaned against the doorway, peering inside. It's just a chair, man, he said with a shrug, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Yeah, but look at the rest of the room, I said, stepping inside. The walls were stripped of paint, patches of mold growing in the corners. The floor was covered in debris, shattered glass, pieces of wood, even an old, tattered blanket. But the chair stood out. It was clean, free of dust or grime, as if someone had placed it there recently. Ian frowned, stepping in behind me. Maybe it's just, I don't know, a coincidence? Patrick chuckled nervously. You're overthinking it. Let's keep moving. This place isn't going to explore itself. His dismissive attitude didn't ease my unease, but I decided to let it go. As we left the room and continued down the hallway, the tension seemed to settle for a while, at least. The unsettling atmosphere returned when we reached a room marked records. The faded lettering above the door was barely visible under years of grime. Patrick pushed the door open with his shoulder, the hinges groaning loudly in protest. Inside, the room was cluttered with filing cabinets, most of them toppled over, their contents spilled across the floor. Papers, some yellowed with age, lay scattered everywhere. Patrick picked up one and squinted at it. Looks like patient records, he said, tossing it aside. Ian crouched down, flipping through a pile near his feet. This one says something about quarantine. He paused, holding the paper closer to his flashlight. And it's dated 1983. What happened in 1983? I asked, stepping closer. Don't know, Ian replied, handing me the paper. The words were barely legible, but I could make out phrases like restricted access and emergency protocols. Patrick wandered to the back of the room, where a large metal cabinet stood upright, its doors slightly ajar. Check this out, he called. As he pulled the doors open, a loud clang echoed through the room, startling all of us. Jesus, Patrick, Ian snapped. Relax, Patrick said, smirking. It's just empty. He was right. The cabinet was completely bare inside, though its pristine condition seemed odd given the state of everything else. As we moved to leave, a new sound stopped us in our tracks, a faint whisper. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but more like the wind shifting through cracks in the building. Except there was no wind here. Ian froze, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Did you guys hear that? Patrick nodded slowly, for once not making a joke. It came from outside the room, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The three of us stepped back into the hallway, flashlights darting left and right. The sound had stopped, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Maybe it's just the building settling, Ian offered, though his words lacked conviction. Patrick moved ahead, leading us toward the next hallway junction. He seemed determined to shake off the growing tension, but his movements were more cautious now, his usual bravado tempered by unease. The next hallway was different. The walls were lined with large, frosted glass windows, though most were shattered or obscured by grime. Our flashlights reflected off the jagged edges, creating a kaleidoscope of fractured light. As we moved further, a low, rhythmic creaking filled the air. Patrick stopped abruptly, holding up his hand. Do you hear that? Ian and I nodded. The sound was coming from somewhere ahead, a slow, deliberate groan, like metal scraping against metal. It's probably just a loose door, Ian said, though he didn't sound convinced. We followed the noise cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway opened into a larger space, a waiting area, judging by the rows of decaying chairs and the remnants of a receptionist's desk. In the corner of the room, a metal gurney stood on its side, rocking back and forth as if pushed by an invisible hand. The rhythmic creaking filled the room, echoing off the walls. Patrick took a step forward, his flashlight trained on the gurney. That's not possible, he said under his breath. Ian grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Don't touch it. Why not? Patrick asked, though he didn't make a move to approach again. Because, Ian replied, his voice shaking slightly, there's no wind in here. Nothing should be moving. The realization hit all of us at the same time. The gurney wasn't rocking because of a draft or a tilted floor. It was being moved by something else. The sound stopped suddenly, the gurney freezing in place. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on us like a weight. We should go, I said finally, my voice barely audible. Patrick hesitated, his usual bravado replaced by uncertainty. Yeah, he agreed. Maybe we've seen enough. We turned to leave, but as we moved back down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My flashlight flickered briefly, plunging the hallway into darkness for a split second before coming back on. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. What is it? Ian asked, his voice edged with panic. Nothing, I lied, forcing myself to move. But I wasn't sure. For just a moment, in that brief flash of darkness, I thought I'd seen a figure standing at the end of the hallway, a shadow that didn't belong. The tension in the air thickened with each step we took through the hospital, and the once familiar feeling of exploring an abandoned building had slowly morphed into something far more unsettling. The flashlight beams we carried no longer illuminated the rooms with the same sense of comfort they had before. Now, they only served to highlight the growing darkness around us, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with each movement we made. As we walked further down the corridors, the temperature dropped noticeably, a chill seeping into our bones. I noticed Ian rubbing his arms as if trying to ward off an invisible cold. "Do you feel that?" he asked, his voice tight with discomfort. His question hung in the air for a moment, and I couldn't help but shiver, not just from the cold, but from the growing sense of something not being quite right. Patrick looked around, visibly on edge. "Yeah, it's colder than it should be in here. This building's been abandoned for years. The air should be stale, but it's almost fresh." His words didn't make sense to me, but that's how it felt. The air wasn't stale, it was too clean, too cold, as if someone or something was actively making sure the place stayed unnaturally preserved. We continued walking in silence, our footsteps echoing off the cracked tiles beneath us. Every now and then, the creak of metal or the rustle of paper from one of the rooms made us pause, but each time we found nothing. It was like the building was playing games with us, showing us just enough to make us feel paranoid, but never fully revealing what was lurking in its depths. We passed another set of rooms, and that's when I noticed it, a door standing ajar with a faint light flickering inside. It wasn't bright, just a soft, flickering glow, almost like the kind of light you'd see coming from a broken fluorescent bulb. But there was no power in the building, at least none that we knew of. The wires had been cut years ago, after all. "Did anyone turn that light on?" I asked, my voice shaky. Ian and Patrick both stopped in their tracks, their heads turning toward the door. Neither of them had seen it before. "No," Patrick said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't think we should go in there." I stood frozen for a moment, my heart thudding in my chest. Every instinct in me told me to keep walking, to leave this place behind. But a part of me, curiosity, or maybe fear, drove me forward, and before I could stop myself, I pushed the door open. The light flickered again, casting strange shadows across the room. It wasn't a large space, just a small office, likely once used by one of the doctors or staff members. Papers were strewn across the floor, most of them yellowed with age, but there was something else that caught my attention. A desk, still intact, sat against the wall. But it wasn't the desk itself that made my stomach tighten. It was the small, tarnished bell sitting on top of it. The kind of bell you'd use to get someone's attention in a waiting room. The bell was ringing softly at first, but steadily, as if someone was gently tapping it. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching the bell sway back and forth in response to an unseen force. "That's impossible," Ian whispered, his voice laced with disbelief. Before anyone could react, the bell stopped. Just like that. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a long moment, none of us spoke. "We need to go," Patrick said, his tone low but firm. He was the first to move, turning toward the hallway. But before he could take a step, the lights in the room flickered once more, this time faster, more erratically, as if something was trying to gain control over them. I turned to follow Patrick, but as I did, I saw something in the corner of my eye movement. A shadow. I blinked and looked again, but it was gone. The door slammed shut behind us with a loud bang that sent us all jumping. "What the hell was that?" Ian's voice trembled, but there was no mistaking the fear in it now. "Did you see that?" I asked, my breath catching in my throat. But neither Ian nor Patrick had seen the shadow. They were focused on the door, which was now standing completely still. "I didn't see anything," Patrick said, his face pale. "But we're done. We're leaving." We didn't argue. At this point, we were all thinking the same thing. We had to get out. Fast. We moved quickly down the hallway, retracing our steps back toward the entrance. But as we passed by one of the open rooms, something caught my attention, something that made me stop in my tracks. There, in the corner of the room, was a figure, a silhouette standing motionless in the dark. It was a man, or at least, it looked like a man. His back was turned to us, his body facing the cracked window. His posture was unnervingly still, as if he was waiting for us. "Who the hell is that?" Ian whispered, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, unable to make sense of what I was seeing. "No idea," I said, my voice hoarse. but he wasn't here when we walked past earlier. Patrick moved to speak, but his voice faltered when he saw the figure too. This is bad. We need to go now. We turned to leave, but as we did, the figure slowly turned around. It wasn't a man at all. The face was hollow, gaunt, as if it had been drained of all life. Its eyes were wide open, dark, unblinking. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Did anyone else see that? Ian asked, his voice high-pitched with panic. I saw it, Patrick said. We all did, but we're not staying here any longer. We didn't need any more convincing. We ran, our feet pounding the hallways, the only sound our breath and the frantic scraping of shoes on the cold floor. The building seemed to stretch on forever, its corridors twisting and turning, but we kept moving, driven by sheer fear. As we reached the front door, I felt something in intense pressure in the air, like the building itself was trying to keep us in. The door wouldn't budge. We pushed against it with all our strength, but it wouldn't open. It was as if something was holding it shut, locking us inside. That's it, Ian yelled, his voice breaking. We're trapped. Panic surged through me, and for a moment, I thought we were done for. But then, with one final effort, the door gave way. We spilled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath, and I didn't look back. I couldn't. We barely made it out of the hospital, but the strange events didn't stop there. As we stood outside, catching our breath, I realized something. One of the last things I saw before I left the building wasn't just the shadow. It was a message scrawled hastily on the wall near the exit. They never leave. The cold night air hit us like a slap as we stumbled out of the hospital, our breaths coming in sharp gasps. We hadn't spoken a word since the door finally gave way, and we stood there on the overgrown front lawn, each of us trying to shake the nightmare we had just escaped. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The feeling of being watched, of something lingering just out of sight, still gripped me, like an invisible hand at my throat. Ian, his face pale and his eyes wide, was the first to break the silence. What the hell was that? I've never been so scared in my life. I didn't have an answer. The figure we saw inside the hospital, the thing that wasn't human, still haunted me, its hollow eyes burning in my mind. The way it had turned around, so slow and deliberate, its body devoid of life. It wasn't real. It couldn't have been. But it was. Patrick stood a little further from us, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He was shaking, but not from the cold. We need to go. Right now. No more screwing around. Go where? Ian asked, frustration and fear lacing his voice. We're not going back in there. No, I don't care what we do, just not here, Patrick snapped. I need to get out of this place. His voice was sharp, but there was something else in it too, something deeper, like a crack in his composure. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just scared. He was terrified. The kind of fear you can't shake, no matter how much you try to tell yourself. It's all in your head. We'll go back to the car, and then I started, but then the ground beneath our feet trembled. It wasn't a small shake. No, the entire ground seemed to shift, and I could hear the faintest rumble from inside the hospital. Like something was moving within the walls, something heavy, something alive. Did you feel that? Ian asked, his voice almost a whisper. He looked at us, his eyes wide with disbelief. I nodded. Yeah, I felt it. What the hell is going on? Patrick didn't say anything. He was staring at the hospital, his face twisted in fear, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to say something but couldn't. He seemed almost hypnotized by the building, like he was being pulled back toward it. No, I said, taking a step back. We can't go back. Whatever's in there, whatever we saw, no, we're done. But Patrick wasn't listening. He turned and started walking toward the hospital, his steps slow and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him, panic rising. I wanted to run, to get in the car and drive far away from here. But Patrick was going back in. He was going to the thing we had just barely escaped. I'm not going back in, Ian said, his voice shaking. You can't make me. Whatever the hell is going on here, we need to just get the police or someone. I grabbed Ian's arm. No, listen to me. Don't go back. We can't do anything. It's too late. But Ian was already shaking his head, his eyes wild. He was having a breakdown. He was terrified. I could see it in the way his eyes darted around, the way his hands trembled at his sides. Patrick, though, he just kept walking toward the entrance. Every step seemed to echo louder than the last. Patrick, don't do this, I shouted, but he didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. At that moment, a loud crash came from inside the hospital. The noise was deafening, almost like the building itself was collapsing. A cloud of dust erupted from one of the windows, followed by a low, guttural noise, a sound so unnatural, so terrifying, that my blood ran cold. Then, from the dark windows of the hospital, a figure appeared. Not the one we had seen earlier, but something much worse, something bigger, something that shouldn't exist. The figure was humanoid in shape, but its limbs were too long, too thin. Its skin was stretched tight over bones, and its face, it didn't have a face. Just a smooth, featureless surface. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank slate of flesh. I could hear my heart hammering in my chest. Patrick, don't, I shouted, my voice cracking. But it was too late. Patrick stepped into the building, his body moving as if he was in a trance. I couldn't understand what was happening. Was he being controlled? Was he compelled to go back inside? His eyes were glazed over, his body rigid as he moved further into the darkness. A scream echoed from within the building, Patrick's scream. It was the kind of scream that no person should ever make, raw and primal, filled with pure terror. Ian, I cried, my voice filled with panic. We have to go in. We have to save him. But Ian shook his head, his eyes filled with horror. No. Are you crazy? We can't go back in there. It's not real. It can't be. But something inside me snapped. I couldn't leave him. No matter how terrified I was, I had to go in. I had to try. I started running toward the entrance, my legs feeling like lead as I pushed myself forward. Behind me, I could hear Ian shouting, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let Patrick die in that place. I slammed through the door, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was a thick, metallic stench, like blood and rust. The temperature had dropped even more, the air heavy and oppressive. The flashlight in my hand flickered, casting weak shadows against the walls. I couldn't hear anything at first. No footsteps, no screams, nothing. Just the deafening silence of the hospital. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The figure. The one we had seen before, the one with the hollow eyes. It was standing at the end of the hallway, staring at me. Its blank face was tilted at an odd angle, as if it was examining me. And then, just as I thought it couldn't get worse, it moved. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat as the creature shuffled toward me, its long limbs dragging across the floor. The air around it felt thick, as if the very presence of the thing was suffocating the space. Patrick! I screamed, but my voice barely reached my own ears, drowned out by the noise of my pulse hammering in my skull. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to respond. The thing was getting closer, its body unnaturally long, its limbs stretched out in grotesque angles. And then I heard it whisper, soft at first, but growing louder as it came closer. You should never have come back, it said. The words didn't make sense at first, but then they did. They were real. It was real. Everything we had seen, everything we had felt, it wasn't just in our heads. It was happening. And just as the thing reached me, its hands outstretched toward my throat, I heard a loud crash. The figure stopped. I don't know why. I don't know how. But it paused, as if something else had captured its attention. I turned my head just in time to see Patrick. He was standing there, his face pale and his body trembling, but alive. And somehow, it was enough. The thing, whatever it was distracted long enough for us to escape. I don't remember how we got out of the building. I don't remember running back into the night air. But somehow, we did. We didn't stop until we were miles away, safe, or at least as safe as we could be. But as we sat in the car, trying to catch our breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following us. Something was waiting, and we all knew it. We drove through the night, our eyes glued to the rearview mirror, as if expecting the hospital to materialize in the darkness behind us. It wasn't until the first light of dawn touched the horizon that we finally stopped, parked at a small, run-down diner on the edge of town. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. The bell above the door jingled as we walked in, but the usual warmth of a diner was absent. There was only a chill that seemed to follow us inside. Patrick didn't say a word. He sat at the booth, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. His eyes were hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days, even though we'd been awake for far less than that. Ian, for his part, didn't look any better. His face was a mask of disbelief, as though he couldn't process what had happened. And maybe, in some twisted way, I wasn't sure I could either. I slid into the booth across from them, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline. My body felt worn out, like I had run miles on end. The terror I felt wasn't just physical, it was deep inside me, gnawing at my mind, keeping me from focusing on anything but that night, that hospital, and the thing we had seen inside. "What was it?" Ian finally asked, his voice low and hoarse. I shook my head. The words didn't come. How could they? How could any of us explain what had happened? Was it just a figment of our imagination? Was the hospital haunted? Or had we stumbled upon something darker, something that didn't want to be found? "I don't know," Patrick said, his voice flat, his gaze fixed on the window. "But I don't want to go back there. Ever." None of us spoke for a moment. I wasn't sure what was worse. The fact that none of us had any answers, or the way that empty silence seemed to stretch out, filling the space with a weight we couldn't shake off. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I broke the silence. "We can't just pretend it didn't happen," I said quietly. "We can't go on like this. I don't know about you, but I don't want to think about it anymore," Ian replied, his voice tight with frustration. "What happened, happened. We got out. That's all that matters." He was right. We were safe. The terror, the shadows, the figure in the hospital, it was over. Or at least, I kept telling myself it was. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something had changed. "We can't just forget," Patrick muttered. He was staring at his hands now, his voice trembling. That thing, whatever it was real. It wasn't just in our heads. I looked at him, my stomach turning. He was right. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that what we had seen wasn't something that could be explained away. It wasn't a trick of the light or a product of stress. It was real. And it was still out there, somewhere. "We need to tell someone," I said, my voice firm now. "We need to report it. This isn't something we can just ignore. Someone could get hurt." But Ian shook his head. "Who would believe us? No one would take us seriously. They'll think we're crazy." Patrick didn't say anything. He just sat there, his eyes distant, as if he was lost in thought. I could see the conflict in him, the way he was struggling to come to terms with what we had seen, what we had been through. I understood. It wasn't easy to face the fact that something not human had been in that hospital. But ignoring it, pretending it didn't matter, wasn't going to make it go away. "Maybe we should just go back to normal," Ian said finally, his voice low. "We don't talk about it. We just go on with our lives." I looked at him, and for the first time, I saw the fear in his eyes. The kind of fear that came from knowing something that you couldn't explain, something that would haunt you forever. I knew exactly how he felt. We sat in silence for a long while, the hum of the diner's old air conditioner the only sound between us. It was like we were waiting for something, waiting for the moment when we would be able to leave it all behind. But no matter how much I tried to block it out, I couldn't escape the truth. The hospital wasn't just a place. It was a symbol of something darker, something I couldn't name but knew was there, lurking beneath the surface. As we left the diner, the sun was fully up now, casting a pale, almost ghostly light over everything. I felt the weight of the night's events on my shoulders, but I didn't say anything. I just got into the car, and we drove away from that place, away from the town and the hospital that had nearly consumed us. For days afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it the thing we had encountered in the hospital. Its featureless face, its long, twisted limbs. I could still hear the way it had spoken, its voice low and raspy, as if it were made of darkness itself. I didn't know if it was real, if we had really seen it, or if our minds had conjured it up in our fear. But the fear, it was real, and that was enough. I tried to move on, to put it out of my mind, but it followed me. It stayed with me in the corners of my vision, in the shadows of my dreams. There were moments when I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that I could hear it, feel it, something watching me, waiting for me to slip up. But I couldn't go back. I couldn't go back to that hospital, to that place where something so unnatural had existed. And as much as I wanted to forget, I couldn't. The three of us never spoke about that night again. We never mentioned the hospital, never talked about what we had seen. It was as though it had never happened. But the silence between us, the unspoken understanding, was enough to remind us that something had changed. We would never be the same. It wasn't until months later that I found out the hospital's dark history. I had come across an old article online, buried deep in the archives of a local news site. The building had been abandoned for years, yes. But before that, it had been a hospital where experiments were conducted on the most vulnerable, those who had nowhere else to go. There were whispers of something more sinister happening behind the closed doors of the hospital. People had vanished, never to be seen again. And even now, there were rumors that it was haunted by the people it had hurt, by the things it had tried to hide. The article didn't provide answers. It only raised more questions. But by then, I was too far gone. I couldn't face it. I couldn't go back. And so, I left it alone. But some nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear it distant, like a memory I'm trying to forget. And I know, deep down, that it's not really over. It's never over. It's been a long time since that night. Time, they say, has a way of dulling the edges of memories. But this one still clings to me, sharp and unforgiving. I can go months without thinking about it, but then something small, a noise, a shadow in the corner of my vision will bring it all rushing back, like it happened just yesterday. I tried to move on. I tried to tell myself that I had done the right thing by walking away, by leaving that cursed hospital behind. But in my quiet moments, I know better. You can't outrun your fears, no matter how far you drive, no matter how much time passes. The truth is, I'll never forget what I saw that night. What we all saw. Patrick and Ian, they haven't changed much. We still keep in touch occasionally, but the connection we once had is different now. That bond we shared before, the kind that only comes from shared experiences, from moments that shape you in ways nothing else can, has been replaced by something else. A quiet understanding, a kind of distance. I think we all know, deep down, that we can never go back to who we were before. It's like we've seen something we weren't meant to see, and now we can't unsee it. I heard a rumor not too long ago, just a whisper, really, that someone else had found the hospital. Someone had ventured inside and never come out. The old town was buzzing about it, the locals whispering about the place's dark past. No one ever seems to know the full story, but the town had been built on secrets, and the hospital was one of its darkest. I didn't know if it was true, or if it was just another ghost story to add to the list. But the thought gnawed me. I'm not sure what keeps me up at night. Maybe it's the fear of that thing in the hospital, lurking in the shadows, waiting for someone else to make the same mistake we did. Or maybe it's the idea that I'm somehow still tied to that place. Maybe there's something in that hospital that can't be left behind, that doesn't let go of the people it touches. I think about it a lot, more than I'd like to admit. There's this nagging feeling in my gut, this sense that I haven't truly escaped. That thing in the hospital, whatever it was, seemed to have a hold on us, a grip that didn't loosen with distance. The more I think about it, the more I wonder if it will follow us forever. At night, when I lie awake, I can almost feel the air in that hospital again, the musty, stale air that clung to the walls, thick with dust and memories that refused to fade. I can almost hear the echo of footsteps in the hallways, the sound of something scraping along the floor. It's a sound that makes my skin crawl, a sound I can't seem to shake. There's a part of me that wants to go back, to face it, to find out what was really going on there. But then the other part of me, the part that still remembers the fear, holds me back. I've seen enough. We've all seen enough. There are some things that once witnessed can never be erased. I'm not sure what's worse, the terror of that night or the terror of never knowing the truth. I try to tell myself that it doesn't matter, that the answers we seek are sometimes better left unknown. After all, some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some truths are too heavy to bear. But even as I say this, I know that the question will linger in the back of my mind forever. What was it? What was that thing we saw? Why was it in that hospital? And more importantly, why did it choose us? Maybe I'll never know. Maybe that's the real horror. The knowledge that some things aren't meant to be understood, some places aren't meant to be explored, and some stories are better left untold. As I sit here, writing this, I wonder if anyone will ever truly understand what happened. Maybe they'll think we were just kids, looking for a thrill, searching for something we weren't supposed to find. But I know what we saw. I know what I felt. And I know that whatever it was, it's still out there, hiding in the shadows of that hospital, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon it. But as for me, I'll never go back. Not to that place. Not to those memories. And I'll do everything in my power to forget the truth we uncovered. Because sometimes, the truth is a far more terrifying thing than any monster could ever be. And so, I leave this story here, not as a warning, but as a reflection. A reminder that some doors should remain closed, and some paths should never be unearthed. Because once you've seen what lies beyond, it's impossible to look away. And sometimes, the scariest part isn't what you've seen, it's what you've left behind. It was a crisp fall afternoon when I set off for what was supposed to be a peaceful hike. I had grown tired of the noise of city life, the constant hum of traffic, the churning of engines, the shouting of pedestrians. It all became too much for me. So I decided to escape to the woods, to lose myself in nature, to embrace the stillness and find some peace. I had always been an outdoor person, and I'd hiked many trails before, but this particular one, the old Redwood Trail, had always intrigued me. It wasn't the most popular path. In fact, not many people took it anymore, but something about it called to me. Maybe it was the mystery surrounding it. Maybe it was the solitude it promised. Or perhaps it was just the thought of being alone, far from the chaos of the world. I had no particular destination in mind, just a vague desire to wander and let the trail guide me. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the path as I made my way through the dense forest. The leaves crunched underfoot, a familiar sound that always brought a sense of comfort. There was a faint scent of pine in the air, and the cool breeze made the trees sway gently, creating a rhythm of their own. I had packed light, a backpack with some snacks, a bottle of water, and a first aid kit, just in case. As a seasoned hiker, I knew the basics. But of course, nothing could have prepared me for what was about to unfold. The trail itself was uneven, with twists and turns that led deeper into the woods. There were no other hikers around, no signs of human life, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. It was the kind of quiet that made everything else feel distant, like I was the only one left in the world. It was both calming and unsettling in its own way. As I walked, my mind wandered. I thought about the stresses of everyday life, work, relationships, all the things that had piled up in my head. The woods felt like the perfect escape, a place to clear my mind and breathe deeply. I wasn't looking for anything extraordinary, just some time away from it all. The deeper I went into the forest, the more isolated I felt. The trees grew taller and closer together, casting darker shadows across the path. I had seen this kind of dense woodland before, but here, something was different. The air felt heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake the feeling, reminding myself that it was just my imagination, but it was hard to ignore. I paused for a moment to take in the surroundings. The silence was profound, the kind of silence you only experience in places untouched by civilization. It was almost sacred, like the forest itself was a living, breathing entity. I couldn't help but wonder how many others had walked this trail before me, and why it had been abandoned by most. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement in the distance, just beyond the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a squirrel, something harmless. But then it stopped, and for a moment, I couldn't see anything. Just the trees, their gnarled branches reaching out like fingers. I hesitated, wondering if I should investigate or just keep walking. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to move toward it. As I approached, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees now almost suffocating in their density. I felt as though I were walking through a tunnel, the light from the setting sun barely breaking through the thick canopy overhead. There was something off about the place. It wasn't just the strange feeling I had, or the flicker of movement I had seen. No, it was something deeper. The air had changed, the temperature had dropped, and the once crisp scent of pine now carried a faint, unpleasant odor. It reminded me of something old and decayed. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thoughts as nothing more than the effects of being alone in the woods for too long. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I continued down the path, though I was now moving more cautiously, listening intently for any sounds, footsteps, voices, anything that might explain what I had just seen. But the only sounds I heard were the wind, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional distant creak of a tree branch. I was completely alone. As I moved deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just a nagging thought anymore, it was a constant presence, an unshakable awareness that something or someone was keeping an eye on me. The feeling only grew stronger as I ventured farther into the forest, each step drawing me deeper into the unknown. The deeper I ventured, the more the woods seemed to change. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the air, a slight chill that seemed to creep into my bones. But then, something more concrete caught my attention. It wasn't anything overt, not a loud crash or a sudden movement, but something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It started with a faint noise, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear, but all I could catch was the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the silence making me overly aware of every sound. But then the noise came again, soft, almost like a hum, distant but unmistakable. I looked around, half expecting to see someone walking just out of sight. But the forest was empty. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their bark rough and ancient. The path ahead was still and undisturbed. Yet, there it was again, the soft, eerie hum, a sound that seemed out of place in the otherwise quiet woods. I took a cautious step forward, trying to locate the source of the sound. My breath was shallow now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. I reached for the flashlight in my backpack, though it seemed unnecessary in the fading daylight. Still, I wanted to be prepared, just in case. The hum persisted, and this time I could tell it was coming from somewhere off to the side, near the base of a large, twisted oak tree. My heart raced, but I pushed the fear aside, convincing myself that it was probably just the wind making strange noises through the branches. After all, I had heard odd sounds in forests before, especially when the air was heavy and still. But as I walked closer to the tree, the noise grew clearer. It wasn't just a hum anymore. It was almost like whispering. The words were unintelligible, too soft to make out, but they were there. I froze in place, my pulse quickening. I looked around again, but there was no one in sight. I took a few more steps, my curiosity getting the better of me. The forest seemed to close in around me, and the path ahead appeared darker, as if the trees themselves were leaning in, watching. The whispering grew louder, and with it, a coldness spread through the air. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to ward off the growing chill. I was now just a few feet away from the oak tree, my flashlight shining in every direction. But the light only revealed more of the dense woods, the shadows stretching long and deep. The whispering stopped suddenly, and for a moment, everything was completely still. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Or perhaps it was waiting for me. I glanced around again, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but the only thing I could see were the tall trunks, their bark gnarled and worn, and the thick underbrush that seemed to stretch for miles. There was nothing unusual, no signs of life, no animals rustling in the leaves, just the unsettling silence. I should have turned back then. I should have listened to that gut feeling telling me to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I reached out to touch the tree, half expecting to feel the rough bark, but as my hand made contact, something strange happened. The ground beneath my feet shifted, a low groan coming from the earth itself. It was so subtle at first that I almost didn't notice it, but as I pulled my hand away from the tree, the ground beneath me seemed to give slightly, as though the soil itself had become unstable. I took a step back, my eyes wide now. The feeling of unease had turned into full-blown dread. I wasn't sure what I had just experienced, but I knew that something wasn't right. The whispering had stopped, but the air was thick with tension, like a storm was about to break. I turned around quickly, scanning the trees once more, but everything was still. Then I heard it. A faint rustling from behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkening woods, but there was nothing there. Just the tall, ancient trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind, their leaves rustling softly. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. It was just an animal, I told myself. Probably a squirrel or a deer. Nothing to be afraid of. But the unease didn't leave me. It only grew stronger. I turned back to the path and started walking again, my steps quick and purposeful. I tried to shake off the strange sensation that had taken root in my mind. There was nothing out here. Nothing at all. Just trees, rocks, and the occasional animal. I could hear the faint sound of running water in the distance. A stream, I assumed. It gave me some comfort, reminding me that there was life out here, that I wasn't in some forgotten place where the world had abandoned all things living. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking, but it felt like the forest was stretching on forever. The path ahead seemed to twist in ways I hadn't remembered. The trees, once scattered and loose, now pressed in tighter together. I glanced back, expecting to see the open trail behind me, but instead I saw only more trees. A sense of vertigo hit me, and I stopped. I checked my map, but it didn't make sense. The landmarks I was supposed to pass weren't there. The path wasn't lining up with anything I had remembered. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought it was my own echo, my mind playing tricks on me in the quiet of the woods. But as I stood still, the sound grew louder. It wasn't the sound of footsteps falling on leaves or gravel. No, these were deliberate, heavy steps, like someone walking just behind me. I turned quickly, my flashlight swinging around the trees. But again, there was nothing. No one. I felt my chest tighten, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was truly afraid. I hadn't been scared up until this point, but now something in the air had shifted. The woods had become something else entirely, and whatever was here with me, it wasn't human. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. My legs moved before my mind could catch up, and I found myself walking faster, then running, not caring about the path or the trail or where I was going. I just needed to get away. But the footsteps followed. Every time I picked up my pace, the sound came closer, quicker, as if whoever was following me was matching my every step. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew that whatever it was, I didn't want to see it. I don't know how much time had passed since I started running through the woods, but the sound of those footsteps never faded. No matter how fast I moved, no matter how hard I tried to shake them off, it was always there. Closer, almost like they were right behind me. At some point, my breath came in gasps, and my legs burned with exhaustion. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let myself look back. The fear of what I might see was stronger than the physical need to rest. And yet, the dread that weighed heavily on my chest was suffocating. It was more than just the fear of being followed. It was the fear that something was wrong with this place, something deeply wrong. I finally slowed down, heart pounding in my ears, but I couldn't keep running without knowing what was happening. So, I stopped. I stood still for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. My flashlight flickered in the dimming light as I scanned the trees around me, but all I saw was the endless sea of dark trunks and underbrush. No footprints, no broken branches, just the eerie silence that felt like it was choking the life out of the forest. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I could see my breath in the air. The wind was still, but the atmosphere felt heavier now. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something, or perhaps something was waiting for me. The sound of those footsteps was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood there, my pulse racing, unsure of what to do next. I wasn't sure if I was just being paranoid, or if something far darker was at play. I turned around slowly, trying to steady myself. I had to find out what was happening. I needed to know if I was really being followed, or if it was just my mind running wild. Maybe I was just exhausted, overtired from the hike, and my nerves playing tricks on me. But then I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, a flicker of movement caught my eye. It was brief, a shadow darting between the trees. My heart skipped a beat, and before I could stop myself, my legs carried me toward it. I wasn't thinking clearly now. The fear had taken over completely. The forest seemed to close in around me as I moved forward, the path now so narrow that it felt like I was walking through a tunnel of trees. The air was dense, almost thick with an oppressive weight, and the rustling of the leaves seemed louder than before. Every step I took felt heavier, and with each passing moment, the silence around me deepened, thickening the dread that had settled in my chest. As I drew closer to the spot where I had seen the shadow, I noticed something strange. The ground was unnaturally still, and the leaves seemed to have settled in a pattern that didn't feel natural. It was almost as if they had been placed there, deliberately arranged. I knelt down to get a closer look, my flashlight sweeping over the ground. But the closer I looked, the more I realized that it wasn't just the leaves. There were marks on the ground, deep grooves etched into the dirt. It looked like something heavy had dragged its way through the earth, leaving behind a trail of disturbance. But there was no obvious source, nothing that would explain the marks. I looked around, trying to understand what could have caused such an impression, but all I saw were more trees, more darkness. No creatures, no answers. A shiver ran down my spine as I stood up again, my gaze locked on the trees ahead. That shadow, that flicker of movement. I had to keep going. I had to find out who or what was out there. I moved forward once again, but this time I was more cautious, more aware of every sound around me. The crunch of my footsteps seemed louder in the stillness, almost out of place. I kept my flashlight in front of me, scanning the area for any sign of movement, but the woods remained silent. Then, without warning, something happened that sent a jolt of panic through me. The leaves under my feet shifted, and I felt a strange, sudden pressure against my ankle, like something had grabbed me from below. I yanked my leg back, stumbling, but there was nothing there. Nothing to explain the sensation. I stood frozen for a moment, looking down at the ground, but there was nothing to see. No roots, no branches, just the ordinary, leaf-covered forest floor. But the feeling lingered, the sensation of something reaching out, something trying to pull me deeper into the earth. It was like the forest itself was alive, and it was hungry. I took a few shaky steps backward, but as I did, I heard it again, the whispering. Faint at first, but unmistakable. It was coming from the trees. It was almost as if the forest was speaking to me, calling me deeper into its embrace. I couldn't explain it. It didn't make any sense. The more I tried to rationalize it, the less real it seemed. But I couldn't deny the chill in the air, the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there, something waiting. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of my vision, but when I turned to look, I saw it clearly. A figure, a shadow, standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It wasn't human, at least not in any way that I could recognize. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape shifting and wavering as if it was made of smoke or mist. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, red and eerie, like embers smoldering in the night. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was stare at the figure, my heart hammering in my chest, the coldness of the air creeping into my bones. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished into the trees, dissolving into the darkness like a wisp of smoke caught by the wind. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. My body trembled uncontrollably, and I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering wildly as I tried to find my bearings. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew that whatever it wasn't something natural. It was something old, something that had no place in the world I knew. I turned and ran again, this time with no destination, no plan, just the desperate need to escape whatever it was that was following me. My breath was ragged, my legs burning, but I didn't stop. Not until I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were in front of me. I ran. My mind screamed for me to keep moving, to get as far away from whatever was following me as I possibly could. My flashlight swung wildly in my grip as I pushed through the underbrush, branches scraping against my face, tearing at my clothes. I could barely breathe, every step a struggle. My legs ached, but I couldn't stop. Not now. I stumbled through the dense forest, the trees seemingly closing in around me. The distant sound of footsteps was louder now, echoing through the woods like a drumbeat, growing closer with each passing second. They weren't human steps, though. I could feel it. The weight of each step was wrong, as if the earth itself was groaning under something far heavier than any person could be. And they were in front of me now. I didn't even dare look back. I pushed forward, running faster than I thought I could, until the trees started to thin out in front of me. I saw a clearing ahead, a small break in the dense woods. It was my only chance, my only hope to escape, and I ran for it with everything I had left. But as I burst into the clearing, I froze. There, standing in the middle of the open space, was the figure. The same one I had seen earlier, only now it was closer. Much closer. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was real, a towering presence, its form an unnatural, shifting silhouette that seemed to distort the very air around it. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, impossibly long, ending in hands that were far too large for any human to possess. Its face, if you could call it that, was nothing but dark voids, a swirling blackness where eyes should be. But it was the eyes that I could feel, the way they bore into me, even though they didn't exist in a traditional sense. They weren't eyes, but I could feel them staring at me, studying me, weighing my every movement. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest, my entire body paralyzed with fear. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was trapped, caught in the gaze of something so profoundly wrong, so ancient, that I couldn't comprehend what it was. All I could do was stare. The air around me seemed to thicken, the wind now a whisper against my skin. The ground beneath me felt soft, as if the very earth was shifting, like something was preparing to rise from beneath the surface. And then I heard the low, guttural sound that seemed to come from deep within the creature, a growl that vibrated through the air like a warning. I tried to speak, to shout, but my voice caught in my throat. The fear that gripped me was suffocating, but it was more than just fear of the unknown. It was the overwhelming sensation that this thing had been here long before I ever arrived, that it had watched me, tracked me, and now that it had me in its grasp, it wasn't going to let me go. The figure moved then, slowly, deliberately, its long limbs swaying like tree branches caught in an unseen wind. My pulse raced, my legs trembling, but I still couldn't move. It was as if my body had betrayed me, frozen in place by a force more powerful than anything I could comprehend. Then, the thing spoke. It was a voice, but not like any voice I had ever heard before. It wasn't human. It wasn't even something I could describe. It was a deep, resonant sound, like 1,000 voices echoing in unison, all of them filled with an ancient malice. And yet, it wasn't words that it spoke. It was something far more primal. An emotion. A sensation. Fear. The word didn't come from its mouth. It didn't even seem to come from anywhere tangible. It filled the air, permeating every part of me. It was inside my mind, my thoughts, wrapping itself around my very soul. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the fear rising within me like a physical thing. It was choking me, suffocating me. I tried to scream, to cry out for help, but nothing came. Only silence. And then, the ground beneath me shifted. A loud crack split the air, and the earth opened up in front of me, like a mouth ready to swallow me whole. From the crack, a dark, oily substance began to pour out, crawling across the ground like it had a life of its own. The smell hit me next foul, like rot and decay, an overwhelming stench that made me gag. I stepped back, but it was everywhere now, surrounding me, closing in. The figure tilted its head slightly, its form twisting and contorting in a way that made my stomach churn. It was like it was made of the very darkness around it, a presence that was both everywhere and nowhere. And as I watched, its shape seemed to ripple and distort, as if it was being pulled in and out of reality. I could feel the air growing heavier. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of my own rapid breathing, the beating of my heart. And then I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time, they weren't just behind me. They were all around me. I turned quickly, spinning on my heel, my eyes searching frantically for any way out. But there was nowhere to go. The clearing had closed in on me, the trees now seeming to bend inward, blocking any escape. The footsteps were coming from all directions now, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. I wasn't alone anymore. And I realized then that I never had been. The ground beneath me trembled as the footsteps grew louder, the shadows around me thickening, pressing in like a vice. I could feel the creatures in the dark, closing in on me from all sides. They were here, and there was nothing I could do. The figure moved again, its long, twisted limbs stretching toward me. But this time, there was no hesitation. It reached out and grabbed me, its hand closing around my arm with a vice-like grip. The coldness of its touch shot through me, an icy burn that spread up my arm, down my spine. I screamed, but it was swallowed by the darkness. I could feel its power now, the weight of it, pressing down on me like an unrelenting force. The creature's form shifted again, its face now so close that I could almost feel the void where its eyes should have been. The air was thick with something ancient, something old beyond time, and as it pulled me closer, I felt the darkness closing in around my mind. I tried to fight, tried to break free, but it was useless. There was nothing to fight, nothing to hold on to. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The figure released its grip on me, and I stumbled backward, falling to the ground, gasping for air. The footsteps, the shadows, the darkness, it was all gone. The clearing was empty now, the trees standing still and silent once again. I was alone. But the fear, the bone-deep terror did not leave. It lingered, settled into my skin, my bones. Something had changed. Something inside me had broken. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that whatever had just happened wasn't over. The moment the creature let go of me, I fell to the ground, my body trembling uncontrollably, my breaths ragged and shallow. I could still feel its presence, that suffocating weight pressing against my chest. But when I glanced up, the clearing was empty. The oppressive silence returned, and with it, a sense of eerie stillness that felt far worse than the chaos that had just unfolded. I sat there, gasping, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. It wasn't real. I had to convince myself. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, some way to rationalize the horror that had just occurred. The logical side of me fought to make sense of it all, to explain away the shadows, the fear, the feeling of being watched, but nothing could make sense of it. The woods had changed. It was as though the very air had shifted, and with it, everything I had known about the world around me had been turned upside down. I tried to push myself up, my legs shaking with every movement, but as I stood, my body refused to obey. The fear still gripped me, a cold, paralyzing force that held me in place. I had to get out. I had to leave this place, but my legs refused to carry me. The path I had come from felt miles away, an endless stretch of trees that now seemed to close in around me, as though they were alive, watching me. I couldn't go back there. I couldn't go back to where the creature had been. But where was I supposed to go? The woods were vast, endless, and now they felt alien. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if something was waiting, something just out of sight, ready to strike. I stumbled forward, my senses on high alert, my eyes scanning the trees. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig felt like a threat. My mind played tricks on me. I kept seeing shadows darting between the trees, hearing the soft patter of footsteps just beyond my hearing. I wasn't alone. I knew that much. But whether the threat was real or just the echo of my own fear, I couldn't tell. As I walked, my thoughts drifted back to the creature, the shadow in the clearing. What was it? What did it want? And why had it let me go? The questions were endless, spinning through my mind like a broken record, but no answers came. There was only the nagging sensation that whatever had happened, it wasn't over. It was still there, lurking in the woods, waiting. And I had barely escaped. I moved faster now, my steps more urgent. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees now an oppressive, suffocating wall. Every step felt like a trap, every moment an eternity. I could hear the wind picking up, the trees groaning as if they were about to collapse. The whole world around me felt wrong, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The sun was beginning to set, and the light in the forest changed, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. I felt like I was being led deeper into the heart of the woods, but the path I had been following seemed to disappear, swallowed by the darkening landscape. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen a familiar landmark, a sign that I was heading in the right direction. The woods had swallowed me whole. Then, in the distance, I saw a flicker of light. It was faint, just a small glow against the thickening darkness. My heart skipped a beat. It was a sign of life. A person. A way out. I stumbled toward it, desperate, not caring who or what it was. I needed to get out of this nightmare. As I drew closer, the light grew brighter, and soon I saw the shape of a cabin through the trees. It was small, but it was real. I rushed toward it, relief flooding my chest. But as I got closer, I slowed, hesitating. There was something wrong. The cabin was too quiet, too still. The windows were dark, and the door was slightly ajar. It didn't look like a place of refuge. It looked like something abandoned, forgotten. I approached cautiously, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but I didn't listen. I needed to be safe. I needed to get inside. As I reached the door, I pushed it open slowly, the creak of the hinges sending a shiver down my spine. The inside was dimmed, lit only by the fading light coming through the cracks in the walls. Dust hung in the air, and the smell of mildew was thick. The cabin had clearly been abandoned for a long time. Yet, as I stepped inside, something didn't feel right. The air was heavy, as if the place had been waiting for me. I glanced around, my heart racing. And that's when I saw it. On the floor, in the corner of the room, was a small pile of objects, dirt-encrusted trinkets, pieces of broken furniture, and something that sent a chill down my spine. A pile of old, yellowed pages, covered in strange symbols. I reached down, drawn to them despite every warning in my head. The pages seemed to hum with energy, like they were alive in some way, like they had been waiting for me to touch them. But before I could reach them, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was no one there. The cabin was silent again, but the air had changed. It was colder now. I felt a presence. It was in the room with me, just beyond my vision. My body went cold with terror, but I couldn't move. I was trapped. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching unnaturally. I could feel them, those eyes, watching me once again. They were waiting for something I couldn't understand. I reached for the door, but it was stuck, like something invisible was holding it shut. And then I heard a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakably real. "It's not over." It wasn't the creature's voice. It wasn't anything I recognized, but it was unmistakably a voice. I backed away, my eyes darting around the room, my breath coming in short gasps. The room seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. I knew then that whatever had happened in the woods, whatever I had encountered, hadn't ended. It had followed me. I didn't know how much time had passed before I managed to force the door open and run out into the night. But as I fled into the forest, the weight of the darkness behind me was suffocating. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the woods, where the lights of the nearby town finally came into view. But even then, I didn't feel safe. The terror didn't leave me. The shadows were still there, just on the edge of my vision, waiting, always waiting. I could feel them even now. I don't know if I'll ever be free of it. I've tried to tell myself that it's over, that the forest, the creature, the shadows, it was all just a bad experience. I've tried to ignore the creeping feeling that haunts me every moment of my life since I left those woods. But no matter how much I try to move on, something lingers. It's not just the memories. It's not just the images that replay in my mind when I close my eyes, the feeling of something waiting for me in the dark. It's deeper than that. Something has changed inside me. The nightmares come more frequently now. At first, I thought it was just the trauma of what happened, my mind's way of processing the fear, the terror I'd experienced. But it's more than that. In these dreams, I find myself back in that place, the woods that seemed to stretch on forever, the trees that bent and twisted, their branches clawing at me like living things. I'm always running, always looking over my shoulder, trying to escape, but it's futile. The shadows always find me. Always. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest, only to find myself staring into the dark room, the silence so thick it suffocates me. But it's not just the darkness that scares me. It's the knowledge that I'm not alone. I can feel them watching, those eyes, the ones I couldn't see but knew were always there. They're still out there, waiting. The town I returned to, where I thought I would find safety, comfort, the familiarity of home, hasn't offered the relief I'd hoped for. At first, everything seemed normal. I tried to live a regular life again. I went to work, met with friends, went through the motions, just like before. But it didn't take long for the unease to settle in. I started hearing things. Soft whispers, voices that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, an overactive imagination. But when I started to hear them at night, when the wind blew through the trees and the shadows in my room seemed to stretch just a little longer than they should, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I've stopped going to certain places I used to visit without a second thought. The woods, obviously, are out of the question. But even the quiet parks near town unsettle me now. The old, abandoned houses I used to pass by, they hold a different kind of darkness now. I avoid them all, and I try to pretend it doesn't bother me. I tell myself that everything is fine, that the strange occurrences I've experienced are just coincidences. But deep down, I know the truth. Whatever I encountered in those woods, whatever was waiting for me in the darkness, has followed me. It didn't stay there. It didn't remain in the clearing where I first felt its presence. No, it has come with me, quietly slipping into my life like an unwelcome guest, one that refuses to leave. And no matter how far I run, no matter how much I try to hide from it, I feel its pull. The shadows follow me wherever I go. I used to think I was just unlucky, one of those people who stumbled across something they shouldn't have, something beyond the realm of normal understanding. But now, I don't know if it was just chance. I don't know if the woods were ever truly just a place of nature, of trees and streams. What if the woods themselves were something more? What if the creature wasn't just some wild thing, but something older, something tied to the very land itself, something that watched and waited, choosing who it would torment next? I sometimes wonder if I was chosen for a reason. That thought, the thought that I might never be free of it, sends a chill through me every time it surfaces. It makes me question everything. The memories I have of that night, the things I saw and heard, it's almost as if the forest was testing me, leading me down a path I couldn't turn back from. I keep asking myself, why me? Why was I the one who stumbled upon it, who found whatever it was lurking in the dark? And then there's the question that I can't shake, the one that haunts me more than anything else. What happened to the others? The people who were there before me, the ones whose lives had been consumed by whatever haunted that place, the ones who had disappeared into the woods, never to return. Were they lost to the same thing that I encountered? Or did they become part of it, consumed by the very thing that now follows me? I've never told anyone what really happened. I've never told anyone about the creature, or the feeling that something is still watching me. I've tried to speak about it, to explain it, but the words never seem to come out right. The look in people's eyes when I mention the woods, the unease that fills the air, it's enough to make me clam up. They don't believe me, and I can't blame them. Who would? Who would believe that something like that could exist? But I know what I saw, and even if no one else does, I can't forget it. There are times when I wonder if I've truly escaped. When I sit alone in my room at night, when the wind howls through the trees outside, I wonder if it's just waiting for me to let my guard down, just waiting for that moment when I'll be vulnerable again. It's a constant, gnawing thought, one that keeps me on edge, one that I can't escape no matter how hard I try. I've stopped going back to the forest. I don't know if I could ever go back, even if I tried. The place feels tainted now, like a part of me was left behind when I fled. There's something in the soil, in the air, something I can't quite understand, but I know it's there. Something dark, something ancient, something that waits for the next person to stumble across it. As I sit here now, in the quiet of my home, I can feel it again. The feeling of eyes on me, the shadows stretching just beyond my line of sight. I don't know if it's real. I don't know if it's just my mind playing tricks on me. But the truth is, I'll never truly know. I'll never have the answers. And that uncertainty, that feeling of being hunted, will always be with me. I can't escape what I've seen, what I've felt, and I don't know if anyone else will ever understand. But maybe, just maybe, that's the way it's meant to be. It was just another night. I'd worked night shifts before. It had always been a routine I found somewhat comforting: quiet hours, the solitude of the night, and an almost meditative silence that allowed me to focus on my tasks. Little did I know, those very same quiet hours would become the backdrop to an experience that would change my life forever. I worked as a night security guard at a small, nearly forgotten industrial complex on the outskirts of town. The building itself was old. Decades of dust and neglect had settled into the corners of the hallways, and the flickering overhead lights had that faint hum, like the low murmur of a forgotten voice. Most of the tenants had long since moved on, leaving only a few scattered businesses operating in the dark, disconnected from the world. I was usually alone. The building wasn't exactly a hotbed of activity, and the only company I had was the occasional janitor, a few truck drivers making deliveries at odd hours, and of course, the random passersby who'd wander in, thinking they'd found something else. The first night I started working there, it didn't seem so bad. It was just another job to pay the bills, and I didn't expect anything strange. I had my coffee in hand, wore my uniform, and settled into the security office at the back of the building. The office was small, with a desk, a computer, and a few filing cabinets, but it served its purpose. There was a monitor on the desk showing the camera feeds from all over the building, and my only task was to watch the screens and patrol the hallways at regular intervals. Nothing more, nothing less. As I settled in that first night, I took stock of the place. It was eerily quiet, even for a building that didn't see much action during the day. The clock on the wall ticked away steadily as I sifted through some paperwork, trying to pass the time. The usual routine of late-night boredom was setting in. I got up to stretch my legs, grabbing my flashlight from the drawer. I gave the security cameras one more glance, making sure everything was running smoothly. The long hallways stretched ahead like lifeless tunnels, only interrupted by the occasional door to an office or storage room. My footsteps echoed against the cold concrete floor as I made my way down the hall. There were moments when it felt like the building was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. That feeling crept up on me every now and then, but I chalked it up to the stillness of the night. After all, how could a place this deserted hold any real secrets? That first week was uneventful. I'd make my rounds, occasionally bump into a trucker or the cleaning crew, and head back to the office to continue my shift. No one ever really paid attention to me. I was just another faceless worker, a fixture of the night. But something started to feel off. Little things at first. A flickering light in a corner where no one had been. A faint sound, like a distant knocking, coming from the storage room when no one was inside. It wasn't anything that would make you jump out of your skin, but it was enough to make me pause, enough to make me feel like there was something else at play here. It wasn't until later, during my second week, that I realized the true scope of the strange occurrences happening around me. By then, I had become accustomed to the patterns of the building, the places I needed to check, the halls I needed to walk. My flashlight beam illuminated the narrow corridors, casting long shadows on the cracked walls. Every so often, I would hear something, like a soft rustling or a creak from behind one of the doors. But when I checked, there was nothing. Always nothing. The most unsettling part was the way the building seemed to change overnight. It wasn't a drastic change, but there was something different about it, something I couldn't quite place. It felt colder, for one. The air became thick with an odd chill that seemed to seep into my bones. The lights buzzed louder, the halls grew longer, and the walls closed in on me a little bit more each night. One evening, as I sat in the office, staring at the blinking security cameras, I noticed something on one of the monitors that I hadn't seen before. A shape moving slowly down the hall in the farthest corner of the building. I wasn't sure if my eyes were playing tricks on me. After all, it had been a long shift, and the fatigue was starting to catch up with me. But the figure on the screen wasn't like anything I had seen before. It was taller than anyone I'd ever seen in the building, and its movements were jerky, almost unnatural. It didn't seem like a person at all, more like a shadow, shifting in ways that made my stomach turn. I quickly grabbed my flashlight and headed down the hall, my heart pounding in my chest. The building was silent as I moved, each step echoing in the quiet, still air. I reached the hallway in question, the one that seemed so much darker than the rest, and scanned the area. There was nothing there, not a soul, just the cold, concrete walls and the soft hum of the lights above. I shook my head and muttered to myself. It had to have been a trick of the light, or the stress was finally getting to me. Still, the unease didn't leave me. I returned to the security office and sat there, staring at the screens, waiting for the rest of my shift to end. The days began to blend together as I slipped deeper into my routine. Each night was more or less the same. Check the security cameras, patrol the empty halls, and fight off the waves of exhaustion that crept in during the long, quiet hours. But something was beginning to shift. It wasn't a sudden change, but more like the slow crawl of something you can't quite identify, a feeling that gnawed at the back of your mind, a sense that something was off, but you couldn't put your finger on it. I'll admit, at first, I chalked it up to my overactive imagination or the fatigue of long hours alone in the dark. After all, this was a dull, forgotten building with little activity beyond the occasional delivery. I was still getting used to the place. And in the early days, when something unusual happened, I convinced myself it was just a fluke. Nothing more. It all started with a single, small event that didn't seem significant at the time. One night, as I made my usual rounds through the building, I passed by one of the old storage rooms near the back. The door was slightly ajar, and there was a faint light flickering from within. I froze, my eyes narrowing. It was odd because I hadn't seen anyone go in or out of that room in days. In fact, I'd only seen it used a handful of times during my shifts. I stepped closer, my boots making little sound on the concrete floor. The door creaked open a bit more as I nudged it gently with my shoulder, and I peered inside. The light I had seen wasn't coming from the usual overhead fixture. Instead, it was coming from a small desk lamp that sat on top of an old filing cabinet, casting strange shadows across the walls. There was no reason for it to be on. No one had been in here, and I was sure I had turned off all the lights before I left for my last patrol. As I stood there, staring into the room, my unease grew. It wasn't just the light, it was the feeling that something didn't belong. The way the shadows danced in unnatural angles. The way the silence felt. Too heavy. I reached out, flicking the light off and shutting the door with a soft click, telling myself it was nothing more than a simple oversight. Maybe I had forgotten to turn the lamp off last time. It was easy to do. After all, I had done the rounds so many times by then. Everything had started to blur together. But that night, as I sat back in my office, trying to push the strange feeling aside, I couldn't shake the thought of the room. The lamp shouldn't have been on. And yet, it was. The longer I thought about it, the more unnerving it became. There was something inherently unsettling about how everything in the building seemed to be. Slowly out of place. Small, harmless things, but they kept adding up. I dismissed it as a fluke. The next night, however, I had another encounter. It was about 2 a.m. when I heard the distinct sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was one of the truck drivers making a late-night delivery or a cleaner. But as I peered through the camera monitor, I saw nothing. The hallways were empty. I checked the feed again, zooming in on the spot where the sound seemed to originate from nothing. Confused, I grabbed my flashlight and headed out into the hall. The building was silent again, and my footsteps echoed through the long, barren corridors as I moved toward the location where the sound had come from. As I approached the area, I could feel my heart start to pound in my chest, my senses heightened. It was hard to describe the way the air felt. It was thick, almost charged with something I couldn't name. I reached the spot and stopped, scanning the area. There was no one around. No truckers, no janitors, no one at all. The hall was as empty as it always was. My breath came out in a slow exhale as I shook my head, trying to calm my racing thoughts. "Just your imagination," I muttered under my breath, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. I continued my rounds, half listening for the next strange noise that would tell me I wasn't just imagining things. But it didn't come. That night, after finishing my shift, I didn't go home immediately. I sat in the security office, the hum of the fluorescent lights above me the only sound in the room. My hands gripped the arms of the chair, knuckles white as I stared at the cameras again. Nothing unusual. Everything seemed normal. But in the pit of my stomach, a knot was forming, one I couldn't ignore. It wasn't until the next night that the tension finally broke. I was doing my usual walk down the east wing of the building when I noticed something strange. A door was open, one that had never been opened before. It was the maintenance room, a space that stored equipment no one ever really used. No deliveries, no reason for anyone to go in there. I approached the door, my flashlight sweeping over the cracked floor tiles. There, sitting in the center of the room, was an overturned bucket, its contents spilling onto the floor. There was a strange, metallic smell in the air, and the lights flickered above. I bent down, my eyes scanning the floor, trying to make sense of it. That's when I saw it, something shiny, something small, half buried under the spilled liquid. I reached out to pick it up, and my heart skipped a beat. It was a small, rusted key. A key that didn't belong to anything in the building. I stood there for a moment, holding the key in my hand, trying to figure out what it could possibly mean. Who had left this here? And more importantly, why had the bucket been overturned? My mind raced as I considered the possibility that someone else was in the building with me. It would explain the strange noises, the flickering lights, and the unease that had been creeping in like a shadow. I tucked the key into my pocket and returned to the security office, my mind reeling. I couldn't just ignore this. Something was happening in that building, something I couldn't explain. But it was still so subtle, so small, that I couldn't convince myself it was anything more than coincidence. But the key was real, and that couldn't be ignored. That night, I didn't feel alone anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal whatever it was that lurked in the darkness. Something was definitely wrong, and I was no longer in denial about it. I sat back in my chair, gripping the armrest as I stared at the cameras, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I hadn't even realized that I had been holding my breath until I let it out in a slow, shaky exhale. The key in my pocket seemed to weigh heavier with each passing minute, a reminder that something was far from right in that place. And I had no idea just how much worse it was about to get. But I would find out soon enough. The building, which had once been a quiet, almost lifeless place, now seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And every time I made my rounds, I felt that tension, an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, but I couldn't prove it. There was no one there when I checked the cameras, no one I could see or hear when I made my way down the long corridors. But the little things, the things I couldn't explain, kept happening. At first, they were easy to dismiss. A light left on in a room that hadn't been used in days. A faint sound of something dragging along the floor when no one else was around. But they were becoming more frequent, more intense, and impossible to ignore. The first major incident happened one night, just as I was about to finish my shift. I was walking past the east wing again, my boots clicking against the cold tile as I made my way toward the back exit. I had just passed the maintenance room where I had found the key when I heard a noise. A soft sound, almost like a whisper. It came from behind me, faint but distinct. My heart skipped a beat as I turned around, flashlight in hand, scanning the hallway. Nothing. The air was thick, too still. The silence stretched on, unnerving in its intensity. I shook my head, chalking it up to my nerves. But as I started to move again, I heard it again. That soft, dragging sound. It was coming from the same direction, deeper into the building, from the storage area I had passed just moments before. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The flashlight in my hand trembled slightly as I took a cautious step toward the sound. It wasn't loud, not at first, but there was something in the rhythm of it that set my nerves on edge. It wasn't the kind of noise that should have been made in an empty, locked building. I moved slowly, methodically, toward the back of the building. As I approached the storage room, the sound seemed to fade. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open, heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the shadows stretching long across the floor. Nothing was out of place. No overturned objects, no signs of movement. Just the usual stacks of old equipment and boxes. Still, the hair on the back of my neck stood up as I stepped inside, feeling the air grow colder as I moved deeper into the room. I swung the flashlight around, checking every corner, every shadow. The dragging sound had stopped, but the feeling of unease hadn't. It was as if something was waiting just beyond my reach, something I couldn't see but could feel, crawling under my skin. I backed out of the room slowly, glancing over my shoulder one last time before closing the door with a soft click. I couldn't explain what I had heard, but I knew that it wasn't normal, and I couldn't ignore it. The next few nights were no better. The strange occurrences became more frequent, more unsettling. I found doors that had been shut when I left wide open when I returned. Equipment that I knew I had checked just an hour before would be missing or moved. The power would flicker, the lights dimming for a second before coming back to life, and I could never seem to get comfortable, no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was nothing. One night, I decided I had to investigate. I couldn't keep running from whatever was happening in the building. I had to know what was going on. I started by retracing my steps, checking all the cameras, all the rooms I had visited over the past few nights. I checked every hallway, every corner, every room that had felt even the slightest bit off. But there was no sign of anyone else. The footage was clear. I had always been alone. And yet, the feeling persisted. The sense that someone or something was just out of sight, just beyond the camera's reach. I checked the maintenance room again, the place where I'd found the key. The light was off, the door closed. Nothing seemed out of place. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was missing something, that there was something hidden in that room, something I hadn't seen yet. I pulled open the door and stepped inside. The cold air hit me immediately, sending a shiver down my spine. I moved toward the filing cabinet, the one I'd noticed on my first patrol. It was still there, still untouched. But something caught my eye. There was a small crack in the wall behind the cabinet. It was barely noticeable, a thin line running along the drywall, almost as if it had been scratched. I crouched down, inspecting it closely. The crack was too deliberate to be an accident, too clean. I ran my fingers along the edge, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath. My pulse quickened as I realized what this meant. There was something hidden behind the wall, something I hadn't seen before. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. Should I investigate further? Should I call someone? But no, I couldn't. Not yet. I couldn't risk anyone else getting involved. I needed to do this alone. I had to find out what was happening, even if it meant facing whatever was hiding behind that wall. I spent the next hour searching for a tool, something to break through the drywall. Finally, I found a small crowbar in one of the storage closets. I returned to the maintenance room, heart pounding in my chest as I stood in front of the wall. My hand gripped the crowbar, my muscles tense with anticipation. I pried at the crack, carefully, slowly, trying not to damage the wall too much. The wall gave way with a loud crack, the plaster breaking away and revealing a small, hidden space behind it. I shone my flashlight inside, breath caught in my throat. There, in the dark, was a small wooden box. It was old, weathered, its surface chipped and scratched. Something about it felt wrong, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. My hands shook as I reached inside the opening and pulled the box out. I could feel a strange, unsettling energy emanating from it, as if it were alive, watching me. I opened the box slowly, careful not to disturb whatever lay inside. There was nothing at first, just a dark, empty space. But then, as I reached further into the box, my fingers brushed against something cold, something metallic. I pulled it out and found a small, intricately designed key. It was the same as the one I had found before, the one I had thought was insignificant. But this one was different. This one felt heavier, as if it carried more weight. It was old, rusted, and coated in some strange substance that I couldn't identify. I stood there, staring at the key in my hand, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Something was definitely wrong, and I had no idea what I had just unearthed. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel a presence behind me, standing just out of sight. I turned, my flashlight sweeping the room in a panicked arc. Nothing, but the feeling was undeniable. I wasn't alone. The tension was thick in the air now, pressing in on me from all sides. Every creak of the building felt louder, every shadow seemed to move, and every step I took felt like it was echoing into an endless void. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was going on. But I didn't know how much longer I could stay in that place. I didn't know how much longer I could ignore the growing terror that seemed to be creeping in at the edges of my sanity. The answers were somewhere in this building, hidden just out of reach. The tension in the air grew unbearable as I stood in the dimly lit maintenance room, the small, rusted key clutched tightly in my hand. The building around me seemed to grow colder, more oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in. Every inch of the place felt wrong. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, the sense of being watched never far from my mind. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the key, my breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. My fingers tightened around it, and the strange substance that coated it felt even colder now, as if it had a life of its own. I couldn't explain it, but there was something about the key that felt ancient, sinister even. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it, the weight of its significance slowly sinking in. I had to find out what this was. I had to understand why it had been hidden here, behind that wall. Something told me it was the key to everything, the key to unlocking whatever dark force had taken hold of this place. But where did it fit? What door did it open? I thought back to the night I found the original key, the first strange event that had set this all in motion. The maintenance room had been the starting point, and now, here I was, holding a second, even more unsettling key. But there was no obvious lock in this room, nothing that would suggest where it might go. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Every creak of the building, every whisper of the wind outside, sent chills down my spine. The silence was almost deafening. But then, a sound broke through the faintest of clicks, a soft noise that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the building. My heart skipped a beat. The sound wasn't coming from the maintenance room, but it was too familiar. It was the same sound I had heard those first few nights. The dragging sound. It was closer now, louder, as if something or someone was moving just out of sight. The hairs on my arms stood at attention as I slowly turned toward the hallway. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I had to know. I had to face whatever was in that building. This had gone far beyond the point of being able to ignore it. With trembling hands, I stuffed the key into my pocket and moved toward the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick, cold air. The dragging sound was louder now, unmistakable in its rhythm. It was coming from the direction of the old storage rooms, the ones I had avoided for days. The ones I had felt drawn to but had always backed away from. Something had been calling me there. And now, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I took a deep breath and stepped into the dark hallway, the light from my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. Every step I took seemed to echo in the silence, amplifying the tension that clung to the air. The dragging sound grew louder, and I could feel it vibrating in my chest, resonating deep within my bones. As I reached the storage rooms, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The coldness wrapped around me like a vice, making it difficult to breathe. My breath misted in the air, and the light from my flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. My mind raced as I moved closer to the door, the drag of whatever was moving behind it growing more intense with each passing second. I reached for the door handle, my heart hammering in my chest. The door was cold to the touch, and I hesitated for just a moment, wondering if I should turn back. But it was too late. I had already come this far, and there was no turning back now. I pushed the door open with a slow creak, the sound grating on my nerves as it echoed through the room. The storage area was dark, the shelves lined with forgotten boxes and equipment. But something was different this time. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the unmistakable stench of something rotting. The dragging sound was now a steady rhythm, like footsteps moving across the floor in slow, deliberate motions. And then I saw it. A figure, cloaked in darkness, was standing in the far corner of the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and distort unnaturally. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its presence, could feel its eyes if it had any locked onto me. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, staring at the figure. It wasn't human. I couldn't explain what it was, but it was wrong. Its very existence felt like a violation of everything I had ever known. The air seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy, and the room grew even colder. I could hear the slow, dragging footsteps now, moving toward me. The figure took a step forward, its limbs twisting in unnatural angles as it moved. Panic surged through me. My heart pounded violently in my chest, my legs frozen in place as I stood rooted to the spot. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. All I could do was watch as it drew closer, its movement fluid yet horrifyingly unnatural. It stopped just inches away from me, and for the first time, I felt a rush of pure terror. There were no eyes, no discernible features on its face, just an empty void where its eyes should have been. And then, it spoke. The voice wasn't like anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't words, not in any language I recognized. It was a low, guttural sound, something that resonated deep within my skull, sending sharp pangs of pain through my head. I stumbled backward, clutching my temples as the sound seemed to reverberate inside me. I could feel my pulse racing, my breath quickening, my entire body on the verge of collapse. The figure didn't move, but its presence seemed to grow. The walls of the room pressed in closer, and I felt a suffocating pressure around my chest. The temperature had dropped to an unbearable level, the cold seeping into my skin, making my teeth chatter uncontrollably. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. I had to get out. I had to leave before it was too late. My legs finally moved, and I turned to run. But as I reached the door, I felt a pressure slam into me, pushing me back. My body collided with the floor with a sickening thud. I tried to get up, tried to run, but something was holding me down. The air was thick now, suffocating. The dragging sound came closer again, growing louder, and then I saw another figure, this time emerging from the shadows, walking toward me with deliberate slowness. The two figures were closing in, their presence overwhelming. The panic I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The room was closing in on me. The light from my flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness. I was trapped, my body frozen with terror, unable to escape. Then I heard it again, the dragging sound. But this time, it wasn't the sound of footsteps. It was something worse, something far worse. A whisper, cold and empty, filled the air. And with that, everything went dark. The darkness that enveloped me felt like an eternity, suffocating and unyielding. Every breath I tried to take seemed to draw in more of that icy, unnatural air, and my chest tightened with each passing second. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. But I couldn't. I couldn't understand any of it. The figures, the dragging sounds, the oppressive weight of the building, none of it made sense. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. My fingers trembled as I pressed them against my temples, trying to make the blinding pain subside. The whispers, the dragging, the overwhelming presence, had they been in my head? Or had they been real? I heard the sound again. That same dragging. It was closer now, growing louder with each passing second. Panic surged through me once more, and I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline flooding my system. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs were unsteady, my body shaking uncontrollably. The room felt alive, like it was closing in on me, The walls seemed to pulse with a rhythmic, almost alive energy. Every step I took, every move I made, felt like it was being watched. No, it was being controlled. It was as if someone was playing with me, leading me down this path, and I had no way of turning back. Then, suddenly, the dragging sound stopped. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The silence that followed was even worse than the noise. It was deafening. It suffocated me, making it impossible to think clearly. In that moment, I realized something. The key I had found in the maintenance room was no longer in my pocket. My heart skipped a beat as I potted my sides, feeling around frantically. It was gone. It had been taken. But by who? Or what? I turned to look around the room, scanning every corner, every shadow. The room felt different now, empty, hollow, like a shell. The presence I had felt moments ago was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. The walls seemed to close in even tighter, as if they had been waiting for this moment to release their grip on me. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the building was done with me, as if I had outlived my usefulness to whatever had been lurking in the darkness. The sense of being hunted, of being watched, had vanished, replaced by a strange, almost peaceful calm. I staggered toward the door, my legs trembling beneath me as I reached for the handle. It was time to leave. I had to get out. I had to escape this place before whatever had been haunting me returned. I yanked the door open with a strength I didn't know I had, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I stepped out into the hallway. The air outside the storage room felt warmer, less oppressive. The chill that had gripped the building was gone, replaced by the familiar, if not comforting, temperature of the building's normal atmosphere. It was as if nothing had happened at all. I didn't stop to think. I didn't pause to wonder if any of it had been real. I just ran. I sprinted through the halls, pushing open doors, barely registering the dim light overhead, my heart pounding in my chest. The exit was just ahead. I could see it. I could feel it. The door that led out of this nightmare was within my reach. When I finally burst through it, the cold night air hit me like a wave, and I stumbled forward into the parking lot. The familiar hum of the city, the distant sounds of traffic, all of it felt almost too normal, too safe. It was so stark in contrast to the horrors I had just experienced that it was hard to reconcile the two. Was it real? Was it just a nightmare, a series of hallucinations brought on by stress, exhaustion? I didn't care to answer that question. I didn't want to. I was just glad to be out of that building, out of that place. But even as I sat in my car, the engine roaring to life beneath me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that whatever had been haunting the building had crossed over with me, that it was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to come back. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I had to get away from this place. I had to leave it all behind. The drive home felt like it took an eternity. I didn't look in the rearview mirror, didn't dare glance over my shoulder. I just focused on the road ahead, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. When I finally arrived home, I didn't even bother with the lights. I just locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, my body exhausted, my mind racing. I didn't want to think about what had happened. I didn't want to remember the darkness, the dragging sounds, the feeling of being hunted. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Days passed, and I tried to move on. I went back to work, but the memories still clung to me like a heavy fog. The building, the strange occurrences, the feeling of being trapped, it all lingered. I couldn't let it go. I wanted to forget, but the shadows of that place followed me, no matter how far I tried to run. One night, I received an anonymous letter. It was strange, unnerving, but not entirely unexpected. It was a simple note, written in a hand that I couldn't place. No return address, no name. Just a single sentence scrawled on the page. "It's not over." I crumpled the letter in my hand, my mind reeling with the implications. What did it mean? Was I being haunted by something beyond this world? Was I truly the only one who had experienced it? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. But that one line kept ringing in my ears, echoing over and over again. As much as I tried to push it away, I couldn't help but feel like I was still being watched, that whatever I had encountered hadn't truly left. Maybe it had only just begun. In the end, I was left with more questions than answers. There were no neat resolutions, no understanding of what had happened to me, no logical explanation for the horrors I had faced. I had fled the building, but I was still trapped in its grasp, its shadow looming over me, refusing to let go. Perhaps it wasn't something I could escape. Perhaps some places, some experiences, leave their mark on you permanently. And no matter how far you run, no matter how hard you try to forget, they'll always be there, waiting. I sat back, staring into the darkness of my apartment, and waited for the next chapter to begin. But I couldn't shake the feeling. It was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before it found me again. The night stretched on like a slow, deliberate crawl, and with each passing moment, the gnawing feeling that I was being watched only intensified. It wasn't a physical presence, not like someone standing in the corner of the room or lurking just out of sight, but something far more insidious, a creeping sensation that never fully went away, even when I closed my eyes. I'd like to say that I moved on, that the passage of time erased the fear that had come to define those dark hours, but the truth was much harder to swallow. I couldn't escape it. It lingered in the corners of my thoughts, like a stain that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The truth is, I didn't just leave that place behind when I drove away from the building that night. It followed me. The memories, the strange sounds, the unnatural silence, all of it followed me home. It seeped into my daily life in ways I hadn't anticipated. The dreams, those vivid, unsettling dreams, became a routine, a constant reminder of what had transpired. Each night, I would close my eyes, only to find myself trapped once again in that dark, oppressive place, struggling to escape, struggling to breathe. In the waking hours, the paranoia gnawed at me. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, never fully went away. I would hear sounds in my house, scratching noises from behind the walls, footsteps that didn't belong to me. I would check the locks on my doors, pull the curtains closed, and sit in the silence, waiting. But nothing ever came. And yet, I couldn't shake the fear that it was just biding its time, that whatever had haunted me was still out there, waiting to finish what it had started. I stopped sleeping well, started skipping meals, my body becoming more frail with each passing day. Work became a blur of faces and empty conversations, my mind always wandering back to that place, that building, those sounds, and that feeling of being hunted. I tried to tell myself it was just a result of stress, of overwork, but deep down, I knew better. I couldn't pretend that the terror I had felt in those dark moments wasn't real. It was too vivid, too tangible to dismiss. I started seeing things. At first, it was subtle just out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darting across the hallway. A figure in the reflection of a glass. I'd quickly turn, but no one would be there. Nothing but an empty room, just like before. It happened more and more often, each time leaving me with a knot of dread in my stomach. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more impossible it seemed to piece together. One evening, while sitting alone in my living room, the weight of it all crashed down on me. I wasn't just avoiding the memory of that night anymore, I was living in it. The lines between reality and nightmare had blurred so completely that I couldn't separate them. It was like I was still stuck in that moment, that time when the world had seemed to fold in on itself. I remembered the way I'd felt the desperation, the suffocating terror, and how powerless I had been to stop it. I picked up the anonymous letter again, the one I had found weeks ago, the one with that cryptic message, "It's not over." I ran my fingers over the paper, tracing the edges of the words as if searching for some hidden meaning, some sign that would finally provide clarity. But it only left me more confused. What was the purpose of this? Why send a note? What did it all mean? I tossed the letter aside, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this wasn't something I could outrun. As much as I wished it were, there were no clear answers, no real escape. I knew that the building had changed me. Whatever I had experienced that night, whether it was real or simply a product of my mind breaking down in the face of stress and fear, it had left its mark. There was a part of me that would always be tethered to that place, to that feeling of being hunted. I had tried to move on, tried to pretend it was just a memory, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It wasn't just an isolated event. It was a part of me now, a part of my story. And that's the hardest truth to face. Some things don't ever leave you. You can run, you can hide, but the shadows always follow. They're in your mind, in your memories, in the things you can't explain. It's like a scar that never fades, a wound that doesn't heal. You can put on a brave face, try to pretend you've moved past it, but you know better. Deep down, you know that whatever haunted you that night, whatever you faced in that building, it's still there. And it's never truly gone. Some stories don't have neat endings. Some experiences don't come with closure. And sometimes, the hardest thing to accept is that not everything can be understood or explained. The fear, the uncertainty, the darkness, they'll always be there, lingering in the background, ready to return when you least expect it. I didn't find peace. I didn't find answers. But I learned something in the process. There are forces in this world, whether physical or supernatural, that we can't always control. Things that leave marks on us, whether we're ready or not. And the best we can do is to keep moving forward, even if we don't know where we're going. As I sit here, reflecting on everything that happened, I can't help but feel the weight of that night still pressing down on me. The building, the dark halls, the sounds, I can't forget it, and I don't think I ever will. Maybe I'll be okay, maybe I won't. But I know one thing for certain, it's not over. And no matter how much I try to run from it, it will always be there waiting. It was a few years ago when I found myself on a secluded stretch of coastline, far from the busy hustle of city life. I had always been drawn to the sea, the salty breeze, the sound of waves crashing against jagged rocks, and the relentless power of the ocean. So, when I heard about an old lighthouse up north, I knew it was the perfect place for a getaway. The lighthouse had stood for over a century, a silent sentinel to the endless tide that rose and fell along the rugged shoreline. It was said to be a beautiful yet haunting place, with the history of its keepers tied to long-forgotten tragedies. But, like most, I didn't pay too much attention to those warnings. In my mind, it was just another piece of coastal history, and surely nothing more. I wasn't alone in this journey. There were a few others with me, friends I had known for years, fellow adventurers who shared my love of the strange and the mysterious. We'd planned to spend a weekend at the lighthouse, hoping to experience the isolated beauty of the place. It was supposed to be a time for relaxation, to escape from the stresses of everyday life. But none of us could have known how much this trip would change us. The group consisted of 5 people, including myself. There was my longtime friend, Daniel, an easygoing guy who loved nature and all things outdoors. Then there was Mia, his girlfriend, who was more skeptical about everything. Her practicality often clashed with the others' enthusiasm for the strange and supernatural, but that made her no less interesting to have around. Tommy, another friend from college, had always been fascinated by ghost stories and legends, and I knew he'd be in his element in a place like this. Finally, there was Peter, a quiet man who kept to himself more often than not, but had a sharp mind and a keen sense for spotting oddities that others might overlook. We were all ready for a quiet weekend away. The drive to the lighthouse was long and uneventful, and as we neared our destination, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're far away from everything, the noise, the crowds, the responsibilities. But even then, as we pulled off the main road and onto the gravel path leading up to the lighthouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air seemed colder here. The trees were bent oddly by the wind, and the distant cry of seagulls gave the entire place an eerie undertone. As we reached the lighthouse, I saw it in the distance, a tall, weathered structure perched high above the rocks. Its whitewashed stone was chipped and cracked, and the beam from its lantern cast a faint glow that seemed to tremble against the darkening sky. The lighthouse had a worn, ancient quality to it, as if it had seen a lifetime's worth of storms, tragedy, and solitude. We parked the car by the lighthouse's small caretaker's cabin, the only other building on the property. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, and the sky had started to take on a deep orange way. It was the perfect time to settle in and enjoy the evening before the real adventure began. We were to stay in the old keeper's quarters, an apartment located at the base of the lighthouse, a place that had been renovated to accommodate guests, but still carried an unmistakable weight of its past. As we unloaded our bags and made our way inside, I couldn't help but notice the strange silence that hung in the air. No sounds of birds, no rustling of trees in the wind, just a heavy, almost suffocating quiet. It was strange, considering we were so close to the ocean, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was just the isolation of the place, the kind of quiet you get when you're far from civilization. The inside of the keeper's quarters was old but charming, with wood-paneled walls and a few vintage nautical decorations scattered around. The small living room had a fireplace and a set of windows that gave a breathtaking view of the rocky shore below. It felt like stepping back in time. Still, there was something about the place that unsettled me. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the corners of the room, or the faint creaking of the floorboards, like the house itself was alive, breathing in the dark. But for the time being, everything seemed fine. We spent the evening cooking a simple meal, laughing, and catching up as friends do when they get the chance to escape the routine of daily life. Tommy had already begun to talk about the stories surrounding the lighthouse, about the previous keepers who had met untimely ends, about the strange occurrences that had been reported by those who had stayed in the area. I had heard some of the same stories before, of course, but the atmosphere here, the strange stillness of the place, made them feel more real than ever. By the time we finished dinner, the sun had set completely, and the only light came from the flickering fire in the hearth and the soft glow of the lighthouse lantern shining through the windows. We decided to take a walk along the cliffs to stretch our legs before heading to bed. The air had grown colder, and the wind was picking up, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of salt water. The lighthouse towered above us as we made our way down the narrow path, its light sweeping over the ocean in regular intervals. It was on that walk that the first unsettling event happened. It was subtle, something that could easily be dismissed in a different setting, but here, in this isolated place, it felt wrong. As we walked along the edge of the cliff, I noticed a figure standing by the rocks below. At first, I thought it was one of the others, but as I looked closer, the figure didn't move. It was a tall, dark shape, almost indistinguishable from the shadows that surrounded it. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, but when I glanced at the others, I saw they had noticed it too. Tommy, always the one to laugh off any fear, was the first to speak. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. "What?" Mia asked, glancing around. "That figure, down by the rocks. It looked like someone was standing there." None of us could explain it. We all stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where the figure had been. The wind howled around us, and the sound of the waves crashing below only added to the eerie atmosphere. We decided to head back to the lighthouse, laughing uneasily at how each of us had seen the same thing, but no one could explain it. As we entered the lighthouse again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The quiet had returned, but this time it felt oppressive, suffocating. Still, we went about our evening, brushing off the strange occurrence as a trick of the light or our imagination. But deep down, I think we all knew there was more to this place than we had bargained for. As the night wore on, and we made our way to our rooms to sleep, I couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. The shadows in the hallway seemed deeper now, the air colder. I tried to shake it off and get some rest, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Something in the dark kept me awake, something that I couldn't name, but that I could feel creeping closer. The next morning, I woke up to the faint sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. For a brief moment, I almost forgot where I was, wrapped up in the comfort of the bed and the warmth of the fireplace that had long since died down. The first light of dawn barely filtered through the curtains, casting a soft gray glow in the room. The peaceful quiet of the lighthouse was, at that moment, almost welcoming. I could hear the others moving around in their rooms, but no one had yet come down to join me. I decided to head downstairs first to make coffee, hoping the hot drink would shake off the lingering fog of sleep. As I passed the small hallway leading to the stairs, I noticed something strange. One of the old lanterns on the wall was swinging gently, as if someone had just brushed against it. The motion was subtle, but it caught my attention. The door leading outside was still closed, and the wind had yet to pick up in any noticeable way, so it seemed odd that the lantern would move at all. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. The lantern swayed once more, and then came to a complete stop. Probably just the house settling, I muttered to myself, shaking off the weird feeling that crept up my spine. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something wasn't quite right. I continued down the stairs, trying to focus on the mundane task of making coffee. But as I passed the window overlooking the cliffs, I saw something in the distance that made my heart skip a beat. At first, I thought it was just the morning fog rolling in, but as I squinted, I realized that it was too dense, too solid to be mere fog. It had the shape of a figure, standing motionless against the backdrop of the rocks. The figure seemed to be tall, almost towering, with no distinct features, just a shadow in the mist. I blinked. When I looked again, the figure was gone. The fog had disappeared, leaving behind only the rough rocks and crashing waves. "Okay, this is starting to get weird," I muttered under my breath. But even as I said the words, I was already trying to explain it away. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my tired eyes playing tricks on me. I wasn't sure. I tried to push the feeling aside, but there was no denying the odd sensation in my gut that something was amiss. The others started to filter into the kitchen as I brewed the coffee, laughing and chatting as if nothing had happened. Mia, always the more practical one, was the first to speak up. "Good morning," she said, taking a seat at the kitchen table. She eyed me, clearly sensing something was off. "You look like you saw a ghost." I hesitated, unsure of how to explain what I'd just seen. "I don't know. I thought I saw someone out there by the rocks," I said, motioning toward the window. But when I looked again, they were gone. Daniel, who had just entered the room, shrugged it off with a grin. "Probably just a shadow or a trick of the fog," he said nonchalantly. "This place has that kind of vibe, you know?" I nodded, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about the place, something that couldn't be easily explained. The day went on, and we spent most of it exploring the surrounding area. The weather was crisp, the sun peeking through the occasional cloud as we wandered the cliffs, taking in the stunning view of the ocean below. We all tried to push the odd feeling from earlier out of our minds, but it lingered like a shadow hanging over the trip. As we made our way back to the lighthouse later in the afternoon, we noticed something else that was off. The door to the keeper's quarters, which had been closed when we left, was now slightly ajar. It wasn't much, just a crack wide enough for a sliver of light to spill out. "Did anyone leave this open?" Tommy asked, walking toward the door. "No," Peter replied, his voice low and cautious. "We all locked it when we left." The door swung open slowly with a creak, and the unsettling silence from the night before seemed to come rushing back. As we stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was faint, but distinct, like something old, like mildew mixed with the salty scent of the sea. I wasn't sure where it was coming from, but it was enough to make the air feel heavy, almost suffocating. "Something's not right," I muttered under my breath. The others were already spreading out, checking rooms, inspecting corners of the room where the light didn't reach. Mia was the first to speak up again. "Look at this," she said, crouching down near the fireplace. I followed her over and saw what she was pointing at, a small, faint smear of something dark across the floor. It didn't look like dirt. It was a strange reddish-brown color, almost like rust, but it was too uniform, too deliberate. "Is that blood?" Tommy asked, his voice low, and the room fell silent as we all took a closer look. No one answered, but the thought hung in the air like a cloud. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something we didn't understand, something we shouldn't be messing with. Peter stepped forward cautiously, inspecting the smear. "It's not blood," he said finally, "but it's definitely not right." We all looked at one another, uncertainty creeping into our expressions. Was this some sort of prank? Had one of us done this as a joke? But that didn't seem likely. No one here had any reason to pull something like that. "I think we should leave," Mia said suddenly, standing up and brushing her hands off. "This place is giving me the creeps." "Relax," Daniel said, trying to keep the mood light. "It's just a little mess. We'll clean it up and everything will be fine." But there was no denying the tension in the air. The longer we stayed in the room, the more it felt like the walls were closing in, the air growing thick and oppressive. We had barely returned to the living room when we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. None of us had gone up there. We were sure of it. I stood frozen, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone walking in heavy boots. The noise echoed through the old floorboards, and each step seemed to reverberate in the pit of my stomach. Tommy was the first to move, slowly walking toward the stairs. "What the hell?" he muttered, reaching for the railing. But before he could ascend, the footsteps stopped abruptly, followed by a soft thud, as though something had fallen. I couldn't bring myself to follow him, but Tommy, undeterred, climbed the stairs. The rest of us waited in silence, the tension so thick it was almost unbearable. After what felt like an eternity, Tommy reappeared, his face pale. "There's nothing up there," he said, his voice tight. "Nothing at all." But even as he said it, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The house had fallen completely silent, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. The sense of unease was unbearable, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. We spent the rest of the day in uneasy silence, trying to act as if everything was normal, but none of us could forget what had just happened. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows felt amplified, like the house was alive with the echoes of something ancient. That night, as we gathered around the fireplace, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. We had come here for a weekend getaway, but it seemed like the lighthouse had other plans for us. And as the wind howled outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening here, whatever had started with the lantern and the strange figure in the mist, was only just beginning. We were about to learn that the lighthouse had a history far darker than we had imagined, and it was waiting to reveal itself to us, piece by piece, like a slow-moving tide we couldn't escape. The strange events we had experienced, the swinging lantern, the inexplicable figure in the fog, the eerie footsteps upstairs, had set a tone that none of us could shake off. It wasn't just the unsettling feeling in the air or the constant noise of the sea crashing against the cliffs below. It was something deeper, something unspoken that hung between us like an invisible weight. The lighthouse had never felt more oppressive. The tension was palpable, almost suffocating. Even though we tried to ignore it, the house seemed to be pushing back against us, as if it didn't want us there, as if we were intruders in a place where we didn't belong. At night, the wind would howl through the cracks in the old walls, sending a cold chill into the room that no blanket could warm. During the day, the shadows grew longer, darker, as though the light itself was afraid to touch the corners of the house. We couldn't escape it, no matter how hard we tried to distract ourselves with small talk, games, or even walks along the cliffs. It was the third night after the first unsettling incident that things began to escalate. I was sitting in the living room alone, the fire in the hearth flickering weakly against the cold, when I heard it again. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and measured, moving across the wooden floors above. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but then the sound grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable. I stood up, heart racing, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, as if whoever or whatever was walking was coming straight toward the stairs. I froze, unable to move, as the creaking of the floorboards echoed through the silence. The air felt thick, heavy with a presence that wasn't just imagined. I wasn't alone. I waited for what seemed like an eternity before I heard the sound of the door upstairs creaking open. The one we'd all been avoiding, the keeper's room, the one that seemed to hold a strange, unspoken weight. I couldn't stay in the living room any longer. My legs felt like lead as I moved slowly toward the stairs, my every step seeming to reverberate in the silence that enveloped the house. I reached the top of the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The faint smell of mildew, mixed with the salty tang of the sea, filled my nostrils. The hallway was dim, lit only by the pale light that seeped through the cracks in the old walls. As I moved down the hall toward the keeper's room, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The door was wide open. I had locked it before we left the room earlier. I was sure of it. But now it was open, just a crack, as though someone or something had been inside. I didn't want to go in. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me behind that door. But the sound of footsteps behind me, the unmistakable sound of someone or something walking slowly toward me, pushed me forward, against my better judgment. As I stepped inside the room, the atmosphere shifted, as if the temperature had dropped by 10 degrees. The air was thick with the scent of something sour, something decaying, as if the room itself had been sealed off from the world for far too long. The faintest light filtered in through a grimy window, casting long shadows across the dusty furniture. At the far corner of the room, the old lanterns we had seen earlier lay on the floor, scattered and knocked over, as if someone had been rummaging through them. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the mess. It was the presence of the same reddish-brown smear I had noticed on the floor earlier, now more pronounced, stretching from the corner of the room and trailing toward the door. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a chair, my breath catching in my throat. There was no logical explanation for this. No rational way to explain why the door had opened, why the lanterns had fallen, or why that stain, whatever it was there. It was as if someone had been standing in the room, watching us, waiting for us to discover this. I turned to leave, but then I heard another sound, soft at first, but growing louder. A faint tapping, like fingers drumming on the floorboards. I looked around, my eyes wide with panic. The room was empty. There was no one there. Then, without warning, the sound stopped, and the air grew still. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay another minute. As I rushed toward the door, I heard a low, guttural sound from the corner of the room. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A voice, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even close. I slammed the door shut behind me and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe. The walls of the lighthouse felt like they were closing in, pressing down on me from all sides. The others had to know about this. I couldn't face whatever was in there alone. I ran downstairs to find the group, my mind racing, my thoughts scrambled. They were sitting around the fireplace when I burst into the room, wide-eyed and frantic. "It's in there," I gasped, pointing toward the stairs. "The room. There's something in there." Tommy raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "What are you talking about? You're acting like you saw a ghost." "No, it's not that. There's something in that room. It's not right. The door was open, and there's a mark on the floor, like blood, and I heard something. It was like a voice." The others exchanged uncertain looks, but they didn't brush me off. Instead, Mia stood up, her face pale. "I don't like this," she said quietly. "It feels wrong here." The whole place feels wrong. We need to figure out what's going on, Daniel said, his voice unusually serious. We can't just keep ignoring this. We all nodded, but no one moved to investigate just yet. We needed to talk. We needed to figure out what to do. But the house was closing in around us. It wasn't just the noise, the footsteps, the voices. It was the feeling of something ancient and malevolent watching us from the shadows. It was the sense that we were intruders in a place that didn't want us there. That night, we huddled together in the living room, talking in whispers, each of us trying to piece together the mystery. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the air felt like a warning. We couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Something was happening, something we didn't understand. But as we sat there, discussing our next steps, the door to the keeper's room creaked open again, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. This time, it wasn't a figment of our imagination. It was real. None of us dared to move. We sat frozen, waiting for what would come next. And then, as if in response to our fears, a voice clear and distinct spoke from the darkness of the hallway, sending a chill deep into our bones. "Leave!" The word echoed in the room, heavy with a warning we couldn't ignore. Whatever had been watching us for days had finally spoken. The house had made its demands known. We were no longer just visitors. We were intruders in a place that wasn't ours to claim. And now, there was no turning back. The tension in the lighthouse was unbearable, a thick, suffocating force that pressed down on us as we sat frozen in the dimly lit living room. The voice we had heard clear, distinct, and full of warning still echoed in my mind, lingering in the air like a bitter aftertaste. Leave. It was a simple word, but it carried so much weight, so much finality. It wasn't a request, it was a command. We couldn't ignore it anymore. The house had spoken, and there was no mistaking the threat that hung over us. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I looked around at the others. Each of us was pale, wide-eyed, breathing shallowly as if the very air had turned to ice. The silence between us was deafening, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the rocks below. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, listening, waiting for us to make a move. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls felt amplified, like the house itself was alive, its presence growing stronger with each passing minute. It was as though the entire structure was vibrating with anticipation, ready to strike at any moment. Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. We all nodded, unable to speak, the weight of the moment too much to bear. The footsteps from the hallway had stopped, but I knew they hadn't gone away. Whatever had been moving around in the dark was still there, still lurking just beyond our sight. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "We have to leave," Daniel finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, but it was laced with urgency. "Now!" But there was no escaping it. The lighthouse had us trapped. The door to the outside world was locked, the windows bolted shut. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling like some ancient, vengeful spirit, its force rattling the walls of the lighthouse. There was no way out. Suddenly, the faintest noise cut through the silence, the sound of a door creaking open. My pulse quickened, my body frozen in place. It was coming from the keeper's room. "Not again," Tommy muttered under his breath, his voice shaking. We all looked at each other, terror written across our faces. We had no choice. We couldn't stay here, and we couldn't leave. We had to face whatever had been tormenting us, whatever was making its presence known with every eerie event, every unexplained noise. But none of us were brave enough to take the first step. The fear was paralyzing, as if the house itself was preventing us from moving. Then, without warning, the lights in the room flickered. At first, it was a soft, almost imperceptible flicker, but it grew stronger, the lights buzzing and flickering violently, as if the house itself was fighting to stay in the light. And then, with a final, deafening crack, the lights went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, slow, deliberate, and heavy, echoing from the hallway. We all stiffened, a collective breath held in the darkness. But this time, the footsteps weren't faint. They were louder, closer, growing stronger with each passing second. I felt my heart race in my chest, every instinct screaming for me to run, to escape, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. We were trapped. There was no way out. And then, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, the door to the keeper's room creaked open. I could barely breathe, my chest tight with fear. My mind screamed at me to turn away, to flee, but my body refused to listen. Something was drawing me toward that door, toward the source of all the strange events, all the terrifying whispers, all the haunting noises. The house had claimed me, and I couldn't escape its pull. I turned to the others, my voice trembling. "We need to go in there." Tommy's face was pale, his lips pressed into a tight line, but he nodded slowly. He didn't want to go either, but there was no other choice. We were already in too deep. We couldn't just wait for whatever was out there to find us. We had to take control, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. We all stood up in unison, our legs shaking beneath us as we slowly made our way toward the hallway. The footsteps had stopped, but the air was thick with the scent of decay, the same sour, putrid smell that had filled the room earlier. The temperature had dropped even further, the cold biting at our skin like 1,000 tiny needles. We reached the keeper's room, and the door swung open, as if it had been waiting for us. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the sea through the grimy window. I stepped inside, the others following closely behind me, their footsteps silent in the oppressive quiet. The air felt heavier here, thicker, like it was pressing down on us from all sides. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it. The stain on the floor, the same reddish-brown mark we had seen before, was now larger, more pronounced. It stretched across the floor, leading directly to the far corner of the room. I couldn't breathe. My legs buckled, and I nearly collapsed to the floor, my hands shaking as I reached out for something to steady myself. There was a figure in the corner, a silhouette standing motionless, shrouded in shadow. For a moment, everything stopped. The air, the sound, even the fear, it all froze in place. And then, as if in response to our presence, the figure moved. Slowly at first, then with sudden, jerking movements, as though it were struggling against some unseen force. The shape twisted and contorted, a grotesque mockery of a human form, its limbs stretching and bending in unnatural ways. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat, trapped by the terror that gripped me. My body refused to move. I could only stand there, frozen, as the figure turned toward us, its eyes, if you could even call them that, glowing with a sickly green light. It spoke then, its voice a rasping, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air around us. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice a cold, cracked whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "You've disturbed the balance. Now you must pay." The room seemed to shift around us, the walls closing in, the shadows twisting and warping. The figure's form seemed to grow, its presence overwhelming, filling every corner of the room. I could hear the others, their voices broken, pleading for it to stop, to leave us alone, but the words were lost in the madness. In that moment, I understood. This was no ghost. This was something older, something far more dangerous than we had ever imagined. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a curse that had been waiting for us, for anyone foolish enough to come too close. And now it was too late. There was no way out. We had crossed the threshold, and the house would never let us leave. As the figure moved toward us, its limbs contorting in impossible ways, I knew there was no escape. The lighthouse had claimed us, and we were its prisoners, doomed to remain within its walls forever. But before it could reach us, there was a sudden flash of light, a blinding, searing light that filled the room, casting everything into stark relief. The figure screamed, its form dissolving into smoke, its words lost in the blinding light. And then, just as suddenly, the light vanished and everything fell silent. The room was empty. The figure was gone. But the air still felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence. We stood there, shaking, unable to comprehend what had just happened. But the message was clear. We had been warned, and the lighthouse had made its claim. The sudden silence that followed the blinding flash of light hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Our eyes darted around the keeper's room, still heavy with dread, the shadows lingering as if unwilling to leave. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. We were all too shaken, too unsure of what had just happened, of what we had just experienced. The figure, that twisted, monstrous thing, had vanished. Its screams still echoed faintly in my ears, but the room felt lighter now, as if some unseen weight had lifted. It was hard to process. After everything we had witnessed, every strange event, every unexplainable sound, it was almost impossible to believe it was finally over. But the emptiness of the room, the lack of that suffocating presence, was both a relief and a new source of unease. We had been so sure that the house was alive, that it was going to swallow us whole, but now it felt like we had won some sort of battle. It was over, right? I think it's gone. Daniel's voice was hesitant, barely a whisper as he stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room warily. The faintest tremor still ran through his body. We were all feeling it, that disjointed sense of fear and disbelief. Mia, always the first to voice her thoughts, shook her head slowly, her eyes wide as she glanced at each of us. Gone? It can't be. It was too real. We can't just pretend that didn't happen. She was right. We couldn't ignore what had happened, what we had seen and felt. The unnatural chill that still clung to the air, the sharp tang of salt water and decay that refused to leave our nostrils, these things lingered like a bad memory. Even as the immediate threat had dissipated, the presence of the lighthouse, that dark, oppressive force, was still there, watching us, waiting. We need to get out of here, Tommy spoke up suddenly, his voice loud and insistent. It's not over. We shouldn't have stayed this long in the first place. Let's just leave. His words seemed to snap us all out of our stupor. It was as if we had been holding our breath this entire time, too terrified to make a move. Now, the idea of leaving, the idea of escaping, seemed like the only choice. We didn't care about figuring out what had happened anymore. We didn't care about the mysteries of the lighthouse or the curse that had gripped it. We just wanted to get away. But when we turned to leave, the door slammed shut. The sound was so sudden, so jarring, it made all of us jump. The door, wooden and heavy, its hinges creaking with a strain, had closed with a force that seemed to reverberate through the walls. We all froze again, panic rising in our chests. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear anyone, but I knew they were all just as frightened as I was. Let's go, Mia said, her voice cracking as she approached the door and tugged at the handle. It didn't budge. It's locked. It's... A loud, violent bang echoed from behind us. It was the sound of something heavy being dropped, something that shouldn't have been there. Our heads whipped around, eyes searching the room frantically, but there was nothing. Only the same oppressive silence, the same overwhelming cold that made every inch of the room feel like a threat. And then, from the far corner of the room, a low, guttural sound rose up, something between a growl and a moan. We all turned, our hearts hammering in our chests, our bodies stiff with dread. The floorboards creaked beneath us, one by one, as something approached. The air seemed to grow thicker with each step, as if the very atmosphere were drawing closer, pressing against our skin. We could feel the temperature drop, and even though I was standing close to the others, it felt as though I was entirely alone, isolated in that moment, surrounded by an unseen presence. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. We stood there, motionless, unable to speak. Time seemed to stretch out into infinity. The air felt like it was being held in place, suspended between what had happened and what would happen. We didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. We were waiting for something, anything that would break the silence, that would let us know if we were safe or if the nightmare was about to return. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open by itself. I don't know how it happened or why, but in that moment I felt a sense of release, as though the house itself had decided to let us go. Without a word, we all rushed toward the door, pushing past each other in our frantic need to escape. We didn't stop to look back. We didn't stop to question what had happened. We simply ran. Down the stairs, through the hallway, we made our way toward the front door. I could hear the others behind me, their footsteps echoing, their breath heavy with fear and exhaustion. The wind outside was still howling, but it wasn't enough to stop us. We were almost there, almost out. When we reached the door, I grabbed the handle, and for a moment, I hesitated. I had to check. I had to know if the lighthouse was truly done with us, if it had finally released its hold. I opened the door. The storm raged on, the wind biting at my skin as I stepped outside into the darkness. The lighthouse loomed behind us, its lights still spinning in the distance. But as we looked back, we saw something that made the hairs on the back of our necks stand up. The keeper's room window was lit. We had left, but it wasn't over. We didn't speak as we made our way down the rocky path toward the road. There were no words. Nothing we could say could explain what had just happened or what we had just experienced. The lighthouse had let us go, but I knew deep down, I knew that it hadn't finished with us. It would never let us forget. When we reached the road, we didn't stop. We didn't look back. We got into the car and we drove. We drove until the lighthouse was nothing but a distant shadow on the horizon, and even then, I could still feel its pull. There are some places in this world that leave their mark on you. Places where you can never truly escape the past, no matter how far you run. As the years passed, I tried to bury the memories of that night, but the haunting pull of the lighthouse never fully let me go. It was as if a part of me had been left behind on that rocky shore, a shadow tethered to the lighthouse, refusing to fade into the past. The others? We drifted apart. We were never quite the same after what happened there, and perhaps that was for the best. Some experiences, some horrors, don't belong in the light of day. They stay in the corners of your mind, tucked away, but never fully erased. I never returned to that lighthouse, nor did any of us. The place had become a stain in my memory, one I couldn't scrub away, no matter how hard I tried. But every time I passed the lighthouse, no matter how far or near it, seemed to tug at me. The fear, the anger, the lingering uncertainty of what had happened that night came rushing back like a flood, drowning me in memories I'd rather forget. It was on one such day, as I drove along the coast, that I saw a new lighthouse being built. I couldn't help but stop the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. It was strange, considering how many lighthouses dotted the coastline, but there was something unnerving about this one. A feeling deep in my gut told me this lighthouse, unlike the others, had something hidden, something sinister. The sight of it stirred something inside me, something I had buried for years. The thought of returning to that place, of confronting whatever force had been at work in the old lighthouse, crossed my mind for a split second. But then I remembered the voices, the pressure, the overwhelming fear we'd felt in that place. And I realized I couldn't do it. No one should. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened there, trying to explain away the unexplainable, but it's never worked. How do you explain the feeling of being watched, of knowing that something or someone was waiting for you, lurking in the dark corners of a room? How do you explain the sensation of ice creeping into your bones, a fear so deep it cuts through every ounce of logic? You don't. You can't. I've read about other haunted places, stories of spirits and curses, legends of past inhabitants that linger in the walls, but nothing compared to what we experienced that night. I've told myself it was just our imaginations running wild, that the stress of the storm, the isolation, the loneliness had caused us to see things that weren't there. But deep down, I know the truth. That lighthouse was never just a building. It was a place of torment. A place where the past had bled into the present, and where the sins of the keeper, whoever he had been, still haunted the land. I'll never forget that night. Not the flash of light, not the figure in the corner of the room, nor the voices that had whispered our names. No matter how far I run, the memory is always there, waiting just beneath the surface. It's in the way the wind sounds when it howls across an empty field. It's in the darkness of a room, in the eerie silence that follows the storm. Maybe some places are just meant to be left alone. Maybe some stories are never meant to be uncovered. There are places in this world where the past refuses to stay buried, where the spirits of those who've suffered refuse to rest. I'm not sure if the lighthouse is one of those places, but I know I'll never go back to find out. Maybe the best way to keep the past in its place is to never revisit it. Some things, some experiences are better left untouched, like a wound that never quite heals. The lighthouse taught me that. It showed me the price of curiosity, the cost of poking at things that should remain hidden. We can never truly know what happened there, what terrible thing had left its mark on that place. But perhaps that's for the best. There are some things that are better left to the past, better left to time. I've moved on, of course, to other places, other stories, other experiences. Life continues, but I've learned to live with the knowledge that some places, some memories, are cursed. And when you cross paths with them, you carry a part of them with you, even if you don't want to. That's the truth I carry with me every day. That's the reality of the lighthouse. No matter where you go, no matter how far you run, the past always has a way of catching up with you. And sometimes it's better to leave it behind. So now, as I sit here, reflecting on everything that happened, I can't help but feel a certain peace. Not because the story is over, but because I've learned something that most people will never understand. There are things in this world that should remain a mystery, things that should never be uncovered. Some stories are better left untold. This is a story I never thought I would have to tell. At first, everything seemed normal, like any other drive, but it quickly spiraled into something I still can't explain. It was a Friday night, one of those rare nights when I had nothing on my schedule. After a long week of work, I was ready to just relax and unwind. The plan was simple. I'd drive home, grab some food, and spend the rest of the night watching a movie. I'd been driving for years, nothing out of the ordinary. Just your average guy who enjoys the freedom of the open road. I'm not a thrill seeker, not really into exploring hidden, dangerous corners of the world, but I like the comfort of the drive. It was peaceful, but that night was different. I was in my car, a reliable sedan I'd owned for a few years, with my GPS set to guide me back home. The route was straightforward, nothing that should have raised any alarms. The weather was clear, the roads were dry, and the hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound breaking the silence. A perfect evening, or so I thought. I had a couple of friends who would often joke about how attached I was to my GPS. They'd tease me, saying it was like my personal tour guide. I'd laugh along, but honestly, I was one of those people who felt a bit lost without it. There was something comforting about the little voice guiding me step by step. I didn't think anything of it when I first started the car that evening. The GPS was its usual self, offering the simplest of routes. The screen flashed with the familiar road names and turns I'd seen countless times before. But as I drove on, something felt off. It wasn't immediate, but over time, the little things began to nag at me. At first, it was the voice. Normally, the GPS would speak to me in a calm, neutral tone. But tonight, the voice sounded different. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. It was subtle, almost as if the voice had shifted pitch ever so slightly. I chalked it up to the fact that I was tired and probably imagining things. The road was quiet, and the night had settled in, so my mind was prone to wander. But the deeper I drove into the night, the more those little details began to add up. The second thing I noticed was the route. At first, the GPS directed me along roads I knew well, but then, without warning, it redirected me onto unfamiliar streets, taking me through a part of town I didn't recognize. I'm not one to panic over a small detour, so I shrugged it off. Maybe there was some roadwork or a blockage up ahead that the system was trying to avoid. But as I followed the new directions, the roads grew narrower, darker, and more desolate. It wasn't a place I had ever been before, at least, not in recent memory. I looked around as I drove, the streetlights flickering overhead. The trees were thick along the road, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into the distance. It was strange. It was almost like the GPS was taking me down a path that didn't exist in the map I was familiar with. But again, I reasoned with myself it was just an update, an issue with the routing system. The technology could be glitchy sometimes. Still, something about the whole situation felt unsettling. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was well past midnight. The silence in the car was oppressive, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. The hum of the engine, the soft clicking of the turn signal, the occasional beep from the GPS as it recalculated my position, everything felt amplified in that moment. I wasn't exactly nervous, but a growing sense of unease was starting to take root. The next time I glanced at the GPS screen, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The map had changed. The roads, which had once been familiar and clear, were now overlaid with strange lines, roads I didn't recognize. No matter how many times I zoomed in or out, the map remained the same, filled with routes and intersections that shouldn't have existed in the real world. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I had never seen anything like this before. The GPS didn't seem to notice my confusion. The voice, still oddly unnatural, calmly told me to make a left turn. I did as instructed, though my instincts were screaming at me to stop and turn around. But I didn't. I followed the directions, driving deeper into this unknown territory. The houses became more sparse, the streetlights more distant. The world outside the car grew darker, as though I was being swallowed whole by the night. I've never been one to believe in supernatural things, but I'll admit there was something wrong about it all. It was like the GPS had a mind of its own. Or worse, like it was trying to lead me somewhere. Somewhere I wasn't supposed to go. As I continued to drive, the road curved, leading me further away from the city. The soft click of the turn signal echoed in the car as I passed an old, run-down gas station. The place was abandoned, its flickering lights casting an eerie glow. It felt like time had stopped there, as though the world had forgotten about this place. That's when I saw it, the sign ahead. The GPS had directed me to take a sharp turn, but the sign ahead read something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The name of the road was unfamiliar. It wasn't a street name I'd ever seen before. It didn't even seem to belong to the area. My gut told me to stop. Something wasn't right. But the GPS, calm and insistent, told me to continue. And so I did. That's when the first real sign hit me. The car began to shake, ever so slightly, as though the road beneath me was uneven. I tightened my grip on the wheel, trying to ignore the strange sensation creeping up my spine. The road was growing narrower, winding into the dark unknown. The GPS was still guiding me forward, but now it felt less like a tool and more like a presence, something that had been with me from the start. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led into something I couldn't escape. The road stretched out before me, a never-ending ribbon of darkness. The headlights barely lit the way, and the night seemed to close in around me, suffocating any sense of comfort I once had. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like hours, and the unsettling silence in the car was only made worse by the hum of the engine and the soft beep of the GPS, guiding me further down this strange path. The roads were now so narrow that I could feel the tires scraping against the edges, the sound almost too loud in the otherwise quiet night. At that moment, I had to admit to myself that something wasn't right. The uneasy feeling I had earlier, the one that had been simmering in the back of my mind, had started to settle into my bones. I wanted to ignore it, to brush it off as just the isolation of being on a long late-night drive. But I couldn't. I glanced at the GPS again. The map was still the same, those strange, unfamiliar roads etched onto the screen, their names unreadable. I zoomed in, trying to make sense of the maze, but it was pointless. The map seemed to be changing, as though it were alive, shifting under my gaze. The roads that I had just passed seemed to disappear from the screen, replaced by more twisted routes, like the GPS was actively redesigning my path. It didn't make sense. The soft voice of the GPS interrupted my thoughts, calm as ever. "Turn left in 200 feet, it said, its tone detached, almost mechanical. It was the same voice that had guided me countless times, but now it felt different, too precise, too impersonal, as if it was no longer serving its purpose as a tool, but as something more. I couldn't help but hesitate. I'd driven through countless unfamiliar streets before, but this place felt wrong. The air felt heavy, the oppressive silence was deafening, and the feeling of being watched seemed to settle in. But there was no turning back now, and I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I followed the instruction and made the turn. That's when it happened. The moment my tires hit the new road, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just the sudden drop in temperature, though the air outside had turned noticeably colder. It was the eerie stillness that seemed to wash over the car, like the world had just gone quiet. Even the usual hum of the engine seemed muffled, as though the car itself was being swallowed by the dark. And then, just as I turned onto the unfamiliar road, the headlights flickered. A sharp flash of light, almost like a strobe, and then darkness. The car's lights were off for a fraction of a second, just long enough to make my heart race. It wasn't a typical electrical glitch, though. The lights didn't just flicker, they seemed to hesitate, as if they weren't sure whether or not they wanted to come back on. When they did finally illuminate the road, I felt a tightness in my chest, an anxiety I couldn't shake. I slowed down, glancing around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The trees along the road were taller now, their branches more gnarled and twisted. The road had become more rugged, as if it had been abandoned long ago. The houses, which had been scattered along the road before, were now fewer and farther apart, and most of them seemed to be in varying stages of decay. Windows were boarded up, doors were crooked, and the faint glow of a few lights flickered in the distance. This wasn't just an unfamiliar area. It felt like I had stumbled into another world, one that existed outside the time and space I knew. I wasn't sure how much longer I could drive. Something about the whole situation felt off, but the GPS insisted I keep going. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, this nagging sense that I wasn't supposed to be here. I checked the GPS again, almost out of habit. The route hadn't changed, but the map was becoming harder to read. The lines were jagged, the streets no longer connected in any logical way. I zoomed out, trying to make sense of where I was, but the GPS froze. The screen went black for a moment, and for a split second, I thought it was going to turn off entirely. But it didn't. The map blinked back to life, but it was different. The roads, the names, even the general layout, it was all wrong. Before I could make sense of it, I heard a noise, a faint sound, like the rustle of something in the trees. I quickly rolled down my window, trying to listen. There was nothing. Not a single rustling leaf or a whisper of wind. The world outside the car had gone still. My breath hitched as I turned the wheel, keeping my eyes focused on the road. The feeling of being watched only intensified. But there was no one. There couldn't be anyone out here. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing. The road behind me was empty, just like the road ahead. But then I noticed something that made my pulse quicken, something I hadn't noticed before. A shadow. It was fleeting at first, just a shape that flickered in the corner of my eye. But as I focused on it, it became more distinct, a figure standing at the side of the road, just out of the reach of the headlights. It was tall, unnaturally still. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car jerked to a halt. My heart was racing now, and I instinctively reached for my phone, but I couldn't bring myself to take my eyes off the figure. I don't know how long I stared at it, seconds, minutes, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Or at least, that's what it felt like. There was no sign of life, no indication that it was a person, but I couldn't bring myself to drive past it. Suddenly, the GPS spoke again, its voice more insistent than before. Continue straight. Destination ahead. I snapped my gaze back to the road. The figure was gone. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, my hands still gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The road ahead was empty, silent, but the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I had to keep going. I had no choice. I slowly pressed the gas pedal again, the car moving forward with a hesitance that mirrored my own. The GPS directed me to another turn, this time to the right. My nerves were on edge, and every sound seemed amplified, the clicking of the turn signal, the whir of the engine, even the way the tires met the gravel. That's when I heard it. A voice! It was faint at first, like a whisper at the edge of my hearing. I turned the volume down on the radio, hoping it was just the wind or some stray sound. But no, it was a voice low, steady, almost like someone was speaking just behind me. I spun around in the seat, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. No one in the back seat, no one outside the windows, just the empty road. I turned back to the front, my hands trembling on the wheel. The GPS was still directing me, its screen glowing faintly in the darkness. The voice, now replaced with the mechanical instructions, gave no indication of the strange events I had just experienced. But I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. I had no idea what I was heading toward, but I couldn't stop now. The GPS wouldn't let me. The road was changing. I could feel it in my gut as the GPS continued to lead me further into the unknown. Every mile I drove felt like I was sinking deeper into some forgotten part of the world, one that didn't play by the same rules as the one I knew. The trees that lined the road had grown denser, their twisted limbs clawing at the sky, their shadows stretching long and dark across the pavement. The air, thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, hung heavy in my lungs, making it hard to breathe. My grip tightened around the steering wheel, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting something or someone to be following me. But there was nothing. The road was empty, save for the occasional flicker of my headlights bouncing off the trees. Still, the feeling that I wasn't alone persisted. It wasn't just the strange silence, the kind of silence that presses in on your ears and makes you feel like you're being watched. No, it was something more. It was the strange, unsettling stillness that seemed to have taken over the world around me, as if time itself had stopped. The world felt suspended in a way I couldn't explain. Every now and then, I would hear a distant thud, like something heavy falling from the trees. But when I would glance out the window, there was never anything there. And then, the first of the truly odd things happened. The road ahead of me, which had always been a solid, unbroken path, suddenly fractured. The GPS blinked, the screen flashing for a moment, and when it returned, the route was no longer as it had been. Instead of a smooth, straight path, the road now split into two, one heading left, the other right. It was a sharp, sudden turn in the direction of the left, which I followed. I barely had a chance to register the change before the GPS voice came on again, calm as ever. Turn right in 500 feet. I slammed on the brakes. There was no right turn. The road was now a steep incline, with no signs of a turn for miles. My heart raced, and I felt an uneasy chill run through me as I stared at the screen. There was no way the GPS was right. I glanced around. The road I was on, the one that had been right in front of me, was now gone. The terrain had changed completely, and the once familiar trees and landmarks had been replaced by dark, jagged rocks and a thin mist that hung in the air like a veil. I pulled over to the side of the road, my breath shallow, trying to steady myself. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had I made a wrong turn? Had the GPS malfunctioned? Or had I driven into some alternate reality, one where nothing made sense? I wasn't sure, but the nagging feeling in my gut told me I shouldn't stay here much longer. I reached for my phone, hoping to call for help, but the signal was dead. I tried to calm myself. "It's just a glitch," I muttered aloud, hoping to convince myself. But there was no answer. The silence was oppressive, as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then, without warning, the mist around me began to swirl, almost as if it were moving of its own accord. My headlights shone through it, casting long, distorted shadows on the road. I could barely see more than a few feet ahead of me, but I knew I had to keep going. I glanced at the GPS again. It was still recalculating, still changing its path, as though it were trying to lead me somewhere or away from something. The once calm voice of the GPS now sounded almost urgent. "Turn left now," it said. But when I looked up, there was no turn, just a long, uninterrupted stretch of road that led into the darkness. My pulse quickened. I knew I couldn't trust the GPS anymore, not after everything I had seen. I couldn't just keep following it blindly. I turned off the device, deciding to rely on my own instincts. I took a deep breath, and with a firm grip on the wheel, I continued forward. It wasn't long before I heard it again, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps. They were soft, just on the edge of my hearing, but there was no mistaking the rhythm. Step, pause, step. My skin prickled with fear, but I couldn't bring myself to look back. I forced my eyes ahead, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. The footsteps grew louder, and I felt the unmistakable presence of something moving beside me. Something or someone was out there, moving in sync with the car. I tried to ignore it, but my heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I could barely hear the engine. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. Nothing. Just the dark, empty road behind me. The sound of the footsteps suddenly stopped, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. I didn't know what to do. Was it my imagination? Was I hearing things? Or was I really being followed? I turned onto another road, hoping to shake whatever or whoever was behind me. But the further I went, the more the world around me seemed to warp and shift. The trees were no longer just trees. They had become twisted shapes, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers reaching into the sky. The mist had thickened, becoming more dense, and the headlights barely penetrated it. I was driving blind now, guided only by the GPS and my increasing sense of dread. At some point, I realized I was no longer on a road at all. I was on a dirt path, narrow and treacherous, with rocks jutting up from the earth like teeth. I slowed down, my knuckles white on the wheel as I tried to navigate this new, disorienting landscape. The path seemed to curve impossibly, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. The GPS, which had once been so reliable, was now showing a blank screen, as though it, too, had given up. That's when I saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the swirling mist, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the path. It was tall, hunched, its form barely discernible against the fog. I stopped the car, my heart racing as I stared at the figure. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. It just stood there, as if waiting. The air in the car was thick with tension. I wanted to scream, to drive away, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey. I was frozen, staring at the figure. Every part of me screamed to run, but I couldn't. The mist around me seemed to press in, forcing me to stay. I reached for the door handle, thinking of running, but just as my fingers brushed the cool metal, the figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate. My heart skipped a beat. What was it? Before I could make sense of it, the figure turned, fading into the mist as quickly as it had appeared. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it real? Had it been a trick of the light? But I knew deep down that it wasn't. It wasn't a hallucination. It had been real. I wasn't alone. I shook myself out of my stupor and started the car again. I didn't know where I was heading, but I had to move. I had to get out of here before whatever that figure was found me. But just as I pressed the gas pedal, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, this time louder, closer. They were behind me. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, pushing the car forward as fast as it could go, but the footsteps followed. No matter how fast I went, the sound of those slow, deliberate steps echoed in the car, growing closer and closer. I could hear them tapping on the road, their rhythm almost mocking the pounding of my heart. My hands were clammy on the wheel, my breaths ragged and shallow. It was as if the mist itself had become a living thing, closing in around me, trapping me in this nightmare. The world outside the car had become a blur, the trees and rocks melting together into dark shapes in the periphery of my vision. I didn't dare look at the rearview mirror again. I knew whatever was following me would be too close, too horrifying for me to bear. But in my peripheral vision, I saw it something moving in the mist, a shadow darting in and out of sight, just beyond the reach of the headlights. I cursed, gritting my teeth, my foot still pressing the accelerator harder than it should have. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. I should have turned back when the GPS first malfunctioned, when the mist first rolled in, but now it was too late. There was no turning back from this. Then, without warning, the car jolted forward, the tires slipping on the gravel road as the car veered off course. The steering wheel twisted violently in my hands, the car careening toward the edge of a sharp drop-off. My heart leapt into my throat. I gripped the wheel with all my strength, trying to regain control, but the car continued to lurch, as if something or someone were tugging at it from outside. The brakes screeched as I tried to stop, but the car refused to slow down. The ground beneath me felt unstable, shifting. In the distance, the mist parted for a moment, revealing something I hadn't seen before, a structure looming in the distance. It was an old, crumbling building, long abandoned, and yet it was the only landmark in sight. A sharp instinct told me that I needed to get there. Whatever was following me, whatever was haunting this place, it wasn't just going to let me go. I fought to keep the car steady as I navigated toward the building, the fog swirling around the headlights like some malevolent force. The sound of footsteps grew louder, now unmistakably closer, as if someone was running just behind me. I stole a glance into the rearview mirror. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a person. The shadow that had been trailing me was no longer human, or at least not entirely. It was a shape, elongated and twisted, its features barely discernible, but I could see it clearly enough to know that it was not something that belonged in this world. Its form seemed to shift, stretching and shrinking in a grotesque way. It was a blur of dark smoke and shadow, but it had an unmistakable presence, one that made my blood run cold. I could hear its breath now, a low rasping sound, almost like it was inhaling and exhaling in time with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. And then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the voice of the Jeepist crackled through the static of the radio. Its calm, automated tone felt out of place, like the words were being forced through a speaker from some distant, forgotten place. "Turn right," it said. I didn't think. I just did. I spun the wheel to the right, the tires screeching against the wet road, and the car lurched violently again. My breath caught in my throat, but I couldn't stop. The building loomed closer, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the mist. Whatever had been following me, whatever had been tormenting me on this road, was now in full pursuit. I could see the entrance of the building ahead, a rusted gate, half broken, swinging on its hinges. There was no turning back now. The road was a dead end, and the thing behind me was closing in with every passing second. I threw the car into park as I reached the gate, my hands shaking as I fumbled to unbuckle my seatbelt. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel its presence. It was here, right outside the car. I grabbed my phone, praying for any signal, but it was useless. The signal was dead, just like the road. I pushed open the door, my breath quick and erratic, and I bolted out of the car. My feet hit the ground with a hard thud, and I stumbled toward the gate, my chest tightening with each breath. The building was dark, but I could make out its shape through the mist. An old house, perhaps once a mansion, now crumbling and forgotten. Its windows were boarded up, and the walls seemed to lean in on themselves, as if the building were collapsing inward. I didn't stop to examine the building further. I ran straight toward the front door, my pulse racing. My mind screamed at me to keep going, to keep running, but my legs felt heavy, my body refusing to comply with the panic surging through me. I reached the front door and yanked at the rusty knob. It didn't budge. I tried again, this time with all my strength, and finally, it gave way, creaking open just enough to let me squeeze through. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I could make out the faint outlines of what once had been luxurious furniture, rotting chairs, broken picture frames, and piles of forgotten debris scattered across the floor. The place felt abandoned, yes, but it also felt alive, as though something or someone had been here, just moments before. I heard the footsteps again, now inside the house with me. They were closer, so much closer. My blood ran cold as I spun around, the shadows around me shifting. I could see it now, a figure, just beyond the reach of the dim light that filtered in through the cracked windows. It was tall, much taller than any human, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. It wasn't just following me anymore. It was closing in, its presence like a heavy weight pressing on my chest. In a panic, I ran down the hallway, not caring which direction I was going, just trying to escape. The air felt colder, the walls closing in on me as I ran, the footsteps echoing louder and louder in the house. The closer I got to the end of the hall, the more the air seemed to hum, vibrating with something I couldn't see, but felt deep in my bones. I turned a corner, and that's when I saw it. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was the thing. It was waiting for me, its face now visible in the dim light. Or rather, it had no face. Just a blank, smooth surface where its features should have been. It was staring at me, unblinking, unfeeling. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The footsteps had stopped. But now, I could hear its voice. It wasn't a voice I could hear with my ears, but with my mind. It was a cold whisper, a thought that invaded my consciousness. You should have never come here. Terror exploded in my chest, and without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I was just trying to get away, to escape whatever it was that had followed me all this way. I could hear it behind me again, the footsteps growing louder, faster. But now, there was something else, something worse. A low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, filled the air around me. The growl was followed by the sound of something scraping against the floor, like claws against stone. I was running, but I was running out of time. I ran. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, my heart thundering in my chest, my breath ragged and panicked. The thing behind me wasn't just chasing me anymore. It was hunting me. Its growls were getting louder, closer, and with each echoing sound, I felt the weight of its presence bearing down on me. The walls of the house seemed to close in, pushing me towards something I couldn't see, but I could feel at the end. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, every turn I made bringing me deeper into the labyrinth of decaying rooms. My head spun, the world around me twisting with each panicked breath. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. My only thought was escape, get out, get away, survive. But then, suddenly, I hit a wall. Not a literal one, but a mental one. I froze, my feet skidding on the dusty floor as I slammed into what felt like an invisible barrier. My body felt heavy, like the air itself had turned against me, holding me in place. Panic surged in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The footsteps had stopped. The growl had stopped. But the silence that followed was worse than anything I'd heard. I turned around, my body trembling, my heart racing as I searched for the thing that had been chasing me. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The shadow, the presence, it was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my chest rising and falling rapidly, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It didn't make sense. There was no way it could have just disappeared like that. I hadn't imagined it. I knew what I saw, what I heard. It was real. But the house around me was still, eerily still. The oppressive air had lifted, and for a moment, I thought I might be safe. I wanted to believe that whatever had been chasing me was gone, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. I turned, my feet heavy as I shuffled toward the exit. But the house felt different now, quieter. The oppressive weight that had been pressing on my chest had lifted, but something else was lingering in the air, just out of reach. As I reached the front door, I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. What if it was still out there? What if I was walking straight into its grasp? I opened the door slowly, peering outside. The mist had receded, and the moonlight shone brightly on the road ahead. The car was still parked where I left it, but the air felt different now. Cleaner, almost. As though the darkness that had hung over me had finally lifted. I stepped out of the house, my feet unsteady on the gravel. I didn't know how I made it here, but I was no longer going to question it. I wasn't safe, not yet, but I was out. That's all that mattered now. The walk to the car felt like a lifetime. Every step was a struggle, my legs sore and aching, my mind still reeling from the terror I had just endured. But when I reached the car, I breathed a sigh of relief. It was still there. Nothing had changed. The world outside the house was just as it had been before dark, quiet, but safe. I climbed into the car, my fingers fumbling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I could feel the vibration beneath my feet as the car hummed softly. I didn't care where it took me anymore. I just needed to leave, to put as much distance between myself and that house as possible. I slammed the gear shift into drive and pulled away from the abandoned building, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as I sped away. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white, my mind still trying to process everything that had happened. It felt like a dream, a nightmare that I would wake from, but I knew it wasn't. I glanced at the GPS one last time. The screen was flickering again, but this time there was no strange voice, no eerie direction telling me where to go. It was just a normal map, guiding me back to the main road. But even as the familiar route appeared on the screen, a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, still being followed. As the miles passed, the tension in my shoulders slowly started to ease. The fog had lifted, and the world outside the car was just as it should be. But I couldn't forget the house, the thing that had followed me. I didn't know what it was or why it had been after me, but the memory of its presence still haunted me, just like the mist that had rolled in. I knew one thing for sure: it wasn't over. Not really. The road stretched out before me, empty and dark. I felt a strange, unsettling calm settle over me as I drove, as if the whole experience had been a warning. But what was the warning? What had I been meant to learn? As I reached the main highway, I saw a sign in the distance, a sign I hadn't seen before, not on the way in. It was an old, rusted sign with faded letters that read, "Do not follow the road to the house." I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. There, at the end of the road, was the same house I had just escaped from. The fog was rolling in again, thick and suffocating, but this time the house was no longer abandoned. Light flickered from the windows, and there were figures moving inside figures that looked too familiar. It was impossible. I had just left, and yet, there it was. The house. The same house. The GPS pinged, its screen showing the familiar route, the same twisted path that led to the house. I looked around the car, my breath coming in short bursts, my hands trembling. The house hadn't moved, but somehow it had followed me. As I stared at the house, the realization began to sink in. The road, the GPS, the eerie guidance, it was all part of something much darker than I could have ever imagined. I had thought I was free. I thought I had escaped, But in truth, I had only just begun to understand the nightmare that had been playing out before me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The engine of the car hummed softly, but I felt nothing but dread in my chest. My eyes flicked back and forth between the sign and the house. How had I ended up here again? Why had the house followed me? I wasn't sure what to do. The sign, which had seemed like a warning, now felt more like a trap. My mind raced with questions. Had the house always been there? Was I part of something bigger, a loop that I could never escape? Or had I simply stumbled upon a place that was cursed, a place where the rules of reality didn't apply? I glanced at the GPS again. It was still showing the same route, the same path that had led me into the nightmare in the first place. My fingers trembled as I reached for the screen, almost afraid to touch it, as though it might somehow make things worse. But I had no choice. I tapped the screen, trying to reroute the system, but the map wouldn't change. It was as if the GPS itself was locked into this cursed course, unwilling to let me leave. The fog rolled in thicker now, swirling around the car like an ancient force trying to pull me back into its grasp. I could barely see the house through the mist, but I could feel the weight of its presence bearing down on me, like a dark shadow that would never let go. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was alive, alive in ways I couldn't understand, in ways that scared me beyond words. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at the house, the world around me growing colder by the second. It was as if the air itself had grown heavy with history, with memories, with some unseen force that had trapped me in this place. The quiet was unbearable, the kind of silence that pressed on your ears, suffocating you with its stillness. Then, something moved. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me. But no, I saw it again, figures in the windows, shadows that shifted and darted in the dim light. There was no mistaking it now. People were inside the house. But they weren't people in the way I understood people. They were something else. They had no faces, just hollow spaces where eyes should have been, where mouths should have been. And yet, they were looking at me, staring through the glass, their presence suffocating in its intensity. I was paralyzed, caught between the urge to run and the knowledge that no matter how far I drove, the house would always be there, always waiting for me. I was caught in a loop, and I knew it now. There was no escape. I snapped out of my trance and slammed the car into reverse, my hands shaking as I floored the gas. The tires screeched on the gravel as I sped backward, hoping against hope that I could break free, that the fog would lift, that the nightmare would end. But as I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw the house again, its silhouette growing closer with each passing second, as though it was chasing me, pulling me back toward its waiting arms. The road ahead blurred in a haze of fear and confusion. I could hear my heart thundering in my ears, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I wasn't just afraid anymore. I was desperate. Desperate to get away, to put as much distance between me and that house as possible. But no matter how fast I drove, no matter how much I tried to outrun it, the house remained there in my peripheral vision, its twisted form taunting me. I turned down another road, then another, trying to break the loop. But each turn I made led me back to the same place, the house. Its lights flickered again, its windows glowing with that strange, unsettling presence. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape. I had driven in circles for hours, or at least it felt that way. My fuel was running low, my mind beginning to crack under the pressure of what was happening. I was losing control. I had to stop. I had to face it. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hand still gripping the wheel as if it were my lifeline. I shut the engine off and sat there, staring ahead into the fog, the house looming in my thoughts, its presence still heavy in my chest. A strange calmness overtook me, a resignation. I was trapped, but maybe this was my fate. Maybe this was where I was always meant to be. Maybe I was never supposed to leave. The GPS flickered again, its screen lighting up, guiding me back to the same twisted path, the same endless loop. But this time, I didn't touch it.